amplified. Sorry, it's okay. So yeah, so policy level things, you know, whether you agree, disagree, you want to kind of turn it up, turn it down, all of that. I did separate, I originally drafted these two as one document, but I separated them a little bit. So there's one called recreation and one called community history and culture. I believe is what I called it. Yeah. So I'm open to starting with either one if anyone had, but maybe stick with one of the documents and then go to the other one of those two documents.
The community and history and culture comes first, right?
Sure. Yeah. There's one agenda item.
Yeah, I don't know if this is policy, but generally art, I think we should have arts and crafts because there's quite a lot of that going on here. Yeah. And instead of just art.
Yeah.
And then I had a question on the objectives, whether in this section, whether it's appropriate to promote development as well as cultural activities, art creation, and public art display. Because we have development, we have a whole section on development. And I'm not quite sure what this means, whether you mean development of art or development in the sense that we understand construction.
No, it wouldn't be as in like land development. It would be like development of the arts or involvement of art in development. So not promoting development, but promoting arts in development.
Development art.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just that needs to be a little more clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Development of.
Yeah, development of maybe.
Yeah, promote the development of cultural activities and those other items.
Because it almost seems like it's listing actions, like activities, development, creation, displays, you know, almost seem like different action items. Okay, so anything else on this first little bit for community, history, culture? Larry?
One piece. The first bullet point talks about engagement with, which to me is really vague. Does that mean identification, preservation, restoration of historic sites?
So it was written vaguely in the objectives. There's a little bit more of the detail in the narrative itself. My intention with that phrase was, there is a tendency, but historically, there has been a tendency to take historic structures, historic landscapes, historic artifacts, and kind of put them over here.
Yeah.
And like, we're gonna, you know, put a fence around it and just leave it over here. The intention of the first bullet was to promote interaction with these things, to promote use of these things. And so engagement with is sort of coming from the museum world, sort of from the curatorial world. Engagement with items, engagement with structures is a phrase that's used in that setting.
I can see using something that says promote, but engagement is like, to me, it's a really amorphous word.
Okay.
So I just, that may be the point goes.
Are you also suggesting that maybe it should say some of those other things you said? You know, you talked about restoration. And I
talked about identification, preservation, and restoration. And when we talk about historic sites, are we talking about indigenous sites? Are we talking about things that we don't even acknowledge as being sites right now?
I mean, like archaeological ones, for example?
Archaeological or indigenous, or it's like historic sites. Are we talking the last 20 years or the last 2,000 years?
Probably a few hundred.
Yeah. I might suggest that for this is a pretty new area in our plans, and I might suggest that in this plan, that might be the question that's posed.
Okay.
As to what does that, acknowledging that we really haven't ever had much dialogue about our history in any substantial way. And maybe this is the starting point of what does it mean to engage in our history, rather than trying to answer it right now, which I'm not sure that, because it's a deep question you're asking.
It is, and that's why I read engagement. It was like, it felt like, what does that mean?
You know, it gets, I think so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we've kind of left that to to Act 250. Like,
Mhm.
you know, I think that it's been kind of a state or federal review, but we haven't really had it as part of our process.
But you can ask for
kinda
somebody
what
to go on the register.
Just you mean in like a development,
Yeah,
like
yeah, and
making sure you're not disturbing an archaeological site. I think that's probably reasonably accurate. There's been some independent sort of work with the sort of colonial and later historical sites, so like with the National Register of Historic Places, like recognition of Wheeler Homestead, like some of the things that are not exactly the same as individual sites. But I think that's probably true that the review of a site for historical value or archaeological possibility has not been at the city level.
Yeah, because you referred to the glacial period and the impact it's had on the landscape. And we know, for example, that in the UVM lands down there are sand areas which date back to the Champlain Sea. So that would be a kind of the kind of archaeological thing that we would want not to disturb or not to destroy.
Do you mean a natural, like geologic process?
No.
You mean human?
We shouldn't, humans.
No, I mean when you're saying there's this area from the former Champlain Sea, that's a geologic timescale level thing. That's not anything that's a creation of humans.
No, but it's there.
Right, but
it shouldn't be
right, but
lost.
This section is, I think,
No,
human involved.
Yeah.
But I get your point.
That actually might come into the next section we're gonna address, because there's a discussion of the landscape.
Yeah. It would fit there.
Okay, anything else kind of as we move down through an inventory and analysis, or, you know, the other text here?
Part of the same discussion, the end of the first paragraph, historic structures, they're talking about development must be sensitive to these structures, and does that mean not cause damage to? That can be very sensitive to you and then put you in the trash can, or
that's up to you. That's a policy decision about how. I mean, there are state and federal level historic preservation and protections. But if something is a home of a certain architectural style from 1982, and it's a particularly good example of whatever architectural style, like, is that something that doesn't qualify for historic register, et cetera, because it's too young, or something that's archaeological or something else
that's too old.
That's too old. Does the city want to take a policy stand on, like, what would you want? What do you want that to say?
So, well, just adding to that,
The development shouldn't encroach or disturb or destroy any of these historic and archaeological sites. And that's why I brought up this Champlain Sea site, because I think, as far as I know, it's the only one I've ever heard of, and it's in South Burlington.
Lori, you want to finish your sentence?
I was just going to say, on the same strain, the last paragraph talks about connecting between the history and our cultural future, keeps the past alive. And how do we successfully integrate Indigenous history into our cultural process? There's this, like you said, Paul, it's a big topic, but there's an area that we have still only glossed over. We recognize the Abenaki in our conversations and so forth, but where we're sitting right now has a lot of history that we don't acknowledge at all. So when we talk about, at some point there may be a reckoning around this stuff, and how does it fit into our strategic plan for our city, and the way reparations and these issues are being dealt with in other areas of the country may be pertinent here as well. And certainly there's been a lot of conversation in Vermont about appropriation of Indigenous lands and that kind of stuff. So I just question how deep we go with this conversation.
Have we discussed somewhere else access to land by the indigenous people who used to live on it?
It came, I think the first time it really came up was when we had the joint session with council with the chiefs and other people's, the panel. It was really interesting, and that came up in the session, but you know, I don't know that it kind of ever made it further than that discussion.
But I think that somehow this conversation, when we talk about our history, is really, this is a ripe time to talk about it, because our history is not all beautiful. And other cultures have come to terms with it a lot better than we have here. And do we want to sort of honor this issue? And we're talking about our historic sites and structures, and it seems like it's a nice one not to think about, but maybe we should be.
Yeah, all we've got so far is an acknowledgement.
In the drafts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it seem, I mean, like Paul's suggestion was like, maybe this is the time where we ID the need to figure out how to do that.
To open this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and you could even talk about in here about how do we, the notion that we want to start this conversation in our community.
Okay.
Well, that could be.
And Paul, it looks like Paul, did you unmute? You want to say something?
Yes, I did. I've been concerned always about the discussion we had with Long's about the Long property. Their house is that red brick house on Spear Street. It was built in 1840 and was at a time the only house on Spear Street when Spear Street was a dirt road. And I've always thought that house should have historical recognition. And I was glad they didn't go forward with their plan to tear the house down. That's what they had wanted to do. But there should be some way for us to designate and protect buildings like that.
I think the plan is not to tear it down now, Paul.
Hope so, yeah. But is there some way we can protect buildings like that around town? I know there's been some, you know, Betty Malizia for a while was looking into all the historical properties in South Burlington. There are quite a few, actually.
Is the Wheeler House registered as a, yeah?
You know, I don't know what's registered and what's not. I have the impression that most is not registered, but other people know more about it than I do.
It seems like across multiple kind of areas, this might be something to build out in the future, at least kind of maybe ID areas that for more study.
Historical preservation is, I mean, if we have a policy that we're going to preserve old structures that have a historical link to this community, then that's probably enough to say at this point. That's a policy that we are going to have register them if appropriate and protect them.
And you know, I think that we'll see with other sections of the plan as we move forward, like this is an area where we don't have like a group championing, like a champion for the things that we're talking about right now. There's other areas of the plan where there's, you know, as we move into this next section of recreation, there's like multiple committees and groups that have championed pieces of that. But, you know, this is one of those where we don't have an active group.
I know a source, a good source. I think a good source is the president of the Historical Society is Sarah Dopp, and she's lived here since
some years.
Since God invented dirt. No, but maybe we could ask her for some advice help?
I didn't realize that, Mike. Yeah, we should.
Okay, moving down through, anything else on?
Scenic quality, I'll
Scenic.
just jump in and say they talk about view shed protections. One thing that's not talked about is protections for only remaining undeveloped shorefront, which is very much scenic and at risk of being lost.
Shoreline.
The undeveloped shoreline that we have, which is it's primarily the Farrell property,
Right.
but it's a gem on our lakeshore, and it could be Googled over by developers easily. And how do we want to protect that as we're protecting our view corridors? Because it is a scenic, it's a big scenic asset that we have. And I don't know if that fits into this context, but it
would fit into the context. I'd love to hear from other commissioners if that's something to include as a possible scenic.
So for the longest time we had on our work plan to do some more work on scenic views, and you know, it hasn't cycled to the top yet with some of these other issues.
Right.
So I mean, we haven't kind of dived back into what's a view shed now versus like what should be added. But you're right. I mean, being able to be at the lakeshore and have that view out is a really different type of view.
Yeah, we're just talking, here it's talking about scenic quality and it's talking about views, and so it's thinking about whether we talk about lakeshore as well.
So Lori, for my own clarification, are you talking about like if you were out at Red Rocks looking down the lake, or are you talking about if you were out in the lake looking back?
If you're on the lake looking back, if you're on the shore, the vast majority of Shelburne Bay is developed. Red Rocks is one of the few places, and the Farrell property is another one of the few places that are not developed. And it's a natural resource that is in scarcity at this point, and a valuable asset to us. Even though, quote, we don't own it, I'm not, but
there is a section
like it makes
on the
sense
lake,
to identify that type of view isn't currently protected, and
I just didn't know whether we wanted it included in the scenic quality section.
Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, and we could say more again in the surface water and groundwater. There's also a section where we have a piece on lakeshore. I think we could enlarge on that there. Yes.
Yeah.
Do you also think under this scenic quality, it should say something along the lines of what you were just saying, Michael, like our protected, like our conservation and resource areas add to the scenic quality of our city? It doesn't say that now. It talks about agriculture, but it doesn't talk about the other open spaces.
Okay. Yep.
Paul, anything else on this section?
Me? Or Paul?
You, Paul.
You, Paul. Paul Engels.
Paulie.
I was, just thinking that maybe it would be a good idea to put forward the idea of having an archaeologist consult with us, and people from the Historical Society, or, there are people who really understand and know this stuff and would probably shed a lot of light on things we know nothing about in South Burlington. And it would be good maybe to have a committee that was looking at these kinds of issues.
It would be good to have some kind of inventory of these valuable resources.
Natural resources.
Yeah.
Well, historical, archaeological. Yeah.
So
perfect kind of thing to.
I was just going to say that so the 2016 plan does include more, they're not exhaustive lists, but more like examples of things. I cut a lot of that out. My intention would be to include references to those sources. So to the, the Historic Register, to the report, I don't remember the date, that established where potential viewshed protection sites may be. To sort of, instead of having all of those lists included in the text of this plan, refer to these other sources for those kinds of inventory kinds of lists.
But Michael is also correct that we do not have an inventory per se of historic buildings eligible for the register, for example. We've never done a comprehensive project like that. So even if regardless of where it is, we have not done a comprehensive one or even a neighborhood by neighborhood.
To back up to the policy, it's good to have a reference to the sources, but the policy that we're talking about is that the plan is to preserve them.
Right.
Paul, were you done with your thought, Paul Ingalls?
Yeah, I think that as part of this iteration of the city plan, it would be a good idea to open all this up to exploration. It's interesting stuff, I think.
Yeah, great.
I got one last little piece in this section, which is the last paragraph where it's talking about agricultural lands. And it says maintaining agricultural lands is a priority. I'd love to see adding the few remaining. Because it almost sounds like we have a lot of agricultural land and it's getting very sparse. Sure. And it's becoming a greater and greater issue. So I would love to see those words added if everybody else agrees.
Yeah. Well, and just a thought for you to hold while you're thinking about that. That also, that statement to me also means that naturally, South Burlington's landscape, if left alone, would likely return to a forest state. So if a farm goes fallow, this statement is suggesting that what we should do is retain the open views, have it for ground nesting birds, what have you, like as opposed to returning to a forested area. And a property that is sort of partway along that path right now is Wheeler Nature Park. I look at photos from, or those of you who were here 30 years ago, it was, other than one patch of forest, it was completely. So, as we think about, there are competing natural resource goods over time, left to its own, that property 40 years from now would likely be pretty forested.
But I think it's also speaking to that, absolutely, but also speaking to maintaining some agriculture base.
Right, and that could be an adjustment in there to talk about not just agricultural lands, but agricultural operations, which is a little bit different from agricultural land as a goal.
Yes.
So just a thought too.
But there's also several hundred acres probably of land that's has potential as agricultural land. Maybe we'll need it when we can't get our food from the West because they're dried out. But not being farmed right now. They may have been farmed in the past, I don't know, but not now. Right now, it's kind of grassland or shrubland, but it's potential.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else for anyone, including the audience, before we move on to recreation?
Just one quick note on cultural facilities that I wanted to make before we went too far. This sort of alludes to a theme that we heard a lot of in the public input over the community conversations. You're going to see it come up in a lot of places. We heard multiple times interest in starting to bring community amenities to the Shelburne Road corridor. Not necessarily specified as to what that is, but acknowledging that the work in City Center is really, beginning to take off. There's a lot of great work. It is pretty far geographically and mentally for folks who live on Shelburne Road. In that area, we heard feedback as related to parks, or as it related to community facilities, or as related to cultural facilities of as we think about bringing more people who live into that area, more employment into that area, that investing in that corridor as more the things that make an area more than a compilation of housing and jobs is was a big theme that I think I heard more in the last 3 months than I'd heard in my entire time here before this time. So I think something is shifting, and this is a note along those lines. And I think with your permission, this is something we'd like to chase further in this plan as well as a new theme that's coming up.
And not a lot of space, but there is some. I mean, you might remember the old, what was it, where Hannaford's is now, what was it called, something plaza?
Yeah, the Kmart. Yeah.
We had workshops out there, and that was, at that time also, people were saying, there needs to be facilities for.
Yeah. Well, and depending on how one looks at it, there's either not a lot of space or a lot of space, right? You know, a place, not to start rumors, but a place like the Shaw's Plaza has tremendous additional opportunity for infill. Yeah. And that could be buildings, it could be conceivably community gathering spaces. There's a lot of things that could be done even in built areas there, because there's a lot of pavement.
And in front of Lowe's and in front of the old Hannaford's,
that's where a lot of big space. That's the place I have in mind, because there's.
And someone mentioned who lives over in that area, it would be great if the pedestrian bridge that's over 180 or over the Intervale that's not being used could be transplanted and put over Route 7 so that there was a connection between the west side and east side of Route 7, because that road is miserable to try and cross.
So with your permission, we would like to sort of lean into that subject throughout the plan.
I saw a lot of head nodding.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So
and we had something from the audience on this section?
Yeah, a couple of questions and comments. Does the city have like a catalog of like colors, fonts, signage, prints, light fixtures that are approved, so that when things get redeveloped as properties, that things have a certain continuous look that is distinct to what South Burlington has approved of?
Yes, I don't know about light fixtures.
Not light fixtures, yes, and also it has been, there's multiple layers of that, and I would say the first layer has been implemented, but there's multiple layers to go with that.
Okay, so that's already a project that's continuing, or that needs to be asked for in a plan like this?
Probably I would say both. To say that, you know, it has been done, but it is a ongoing effort to do that and to bring it to the next levels. So our large parks have been I hate the word branded, but have been branded in that manner, but not necessarily our smaller parks, not necessarily our gateways, not necessarily all the communications that we do using necessarily all the same colors. There's multiple layers to how one could do that, as to help build the sense of place from visual representation.
So, so just to put that thought bubble out to people's heads as to the level of branding, for lack of a better term, that helps to enshrine a sense of place and distinct culture. A question about the view sheds. Are those listed on one of our resource maps? Yeah, thank you. And is views from highways considered? When I speak to people from out of the area, they often talk about what they see driving through. And there's more and more getting built up around the highway, you know, FedEx, for example. And has there been consideration to either visual buffers or view type preservation from those passerbys and their impression of this location, if that's ever come up before? Just again, like there might not be an answer to that right now, but as kind of a thought.
You know, I think a lot of, not the highway, I don't think any of our view sheds are specific to like the interstate, but they are all from public accessible areas. It's not, they're not about view sheds from a person's house. It's about locations where the general public would be able to view from, most of which are our local, like our town roads, city roads.
Right. There is one component in our regulations that where the Development Review Board has the authority to grant a height waiver, additional height beyond the standard of our regulations that views, scenic views from public roads is a consideration. And so using your example of FedEx, there's sort of a strategic berming that keeps the profile of that building a little bit low because Mount Mansfield is in behind there. So it was a consideration, but it's not a mapped resource per se.
Yeah, the FedEx building doesn't stick out so much, but OnLogic is multiple stories. So.
I think you may be thinking about the one that's under construction now is OnLogic.
Right, FedEx is already built.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if any of you ever walked to the Whale's Tails. There's,
sure.
You see trails out there. But a lot of recent comments about how much this area is very unpleasant now. Not that it wasn't loud with traffic volume before, but people driving up the highway see the Whale's Tails and it's notable, but there also isn't any branding for people passing through that, like South Burlington's an actual place or anything to kind of make a sense of this is a beautiful place to be, or you might want to get off the highway more. Just those kinds of thoughts and considerations going into the future.
So moving on to recreation resources. Any initial comments on the first section?
I only had at the bottom of the page, I had a couple of questions that you say the remainder are duplexes, but a duplex is also a multi-family building. So why are they?
Because there's single family, there's two family, and then there's multifamily. It's 3 categories. A duplex is not considered a multifamily.
Really?
Yeah.
So that's the sort of 6% remaining?
Yeah.
Okay, and the other question I had, in one of our charts, we showed that 85% of the buildings were multifamily, and it's now only 2/3.
No, 85% was 85% of
since 2000.
Since 2000 has been in our transit overlay district. It's not multifamily. It's the location has been in transit overlay. That's the 85% that I remember.
That's not on the chart you showed us.
The chart was 2/3 multifamily, and the
which chart?
Just from the
when we were doing the public.
Oh, okay.
There was a slide.
Right there. It is also I'm not sure if it's 85, but a very high percentage of our housing in the last few years has been multifamily also.
Okay.
In addition to what you're saying.
What I think Michael's saying is since 2000 or 2010. I
think that you gave a date range, but the number I remember was 85% of the buildings were multifamily.
So it sounds like you're asking her to check where it says 2/3 and make sure 2/3 is the correct number.
Yep.
Laura?
To the top of this page, where it's talking about recreational resource and opportunities, in the second paragraph, it mentions developed and natural, but pretty much everything in here is about developed recreational lands.
Yep.
And particularly since COVID, but more and more our natural lands are becoming recreation lands. They're getting very heavily used. We talk about 7.5 acres of developed recreation land for every 1,000 residents. I would like to know what we want in the way of natural recreation lands per 1,000 people. I think it's really important to include the differentiation between those two, because those natural lands are getting used more and more and more, and they're showing significant signs of wear, and perhaps in as much of a shortage as the developed recreation lands. So I'd really like to see that expanded here so that we're talking about both.
Do you know if the Rec and Parks Committee has explored that at all yet, and or staff? Okay.
No, I know that the 7.5 acres per 1,000 is of developed parklands. I talked to Holly, the recreation director, a bit about this. They haven't really gotten into that conversation.
So I would really like to see
there may be some work that we can do on that, if that's an interest to the commission. I think that there are some metrics out there on I believe the word I've heard in the past is passive recreation land.
Yeah.
To complement active.
Or this talks about developed, or it could be natural recreation lands. Because it's Red Rocks Park, it's Wheeler Park, it's all these other areas. And you look at the trails in all of them now, as opposed to 4 years ago, and they've gone from trails to boulevards. A lot of them. And so the other thing was, it talks about locating a recreational amenity within a quarter mile of every dwelling unit. Do we know, can anybody tell me or put in here what the greatest current distance is now from a dwelling unit to a recreation area?
We can do that. There is an area of the city where it's a large number. The Country Club Estates neighborhood, which I don't have an easy answer to, is a long distance from a developed recreation.
Exactly, yes.
Passive ones owned by the Municipal Valley Parks District. So but that's probably the largest one, and the number would probably say like a mile or a mile and a half, because it's just so likely if there is one nearby, it's not in our community.
So I don't know if it would be useful to have, and maybe we have it already, this on a map so that we can see where the developed and where the natural recreation areas are and how they overlay in relationship to where our populations are.
So we're starting to work with an outside consultant to do some of our GIS mapping work for this purpose. And so I'll definitely make a note of that as something that would be helpful to have as mapping, both mapping natural and developed recreational resources, the distances from dwelling units, and see if we can get some answers about how far away people are.
We do have some of this, the 2015 open space report did do some level of analysis in that. So either we can pull from that or refresh it.
Yep.
Okay. So in the bullets, are we going to add a bullet that talks about natural recreation land, so that we don't just have the one about developed recreation land?
In acres, like mirroring the first one, having a second one?
Yeah.
I mean, that's up to you all, but that
talks about a target that we're looking for.
I think that's a great idea.
And I will say, I will just note that just looking at the numbers and just adding up the acreages, there is more natural in the city than there is developed parkland, just adding it up. It's close to 50-50 actually, but there's actually more natural. When you count Wheeler as being natural, there's some large parcels that are natural recreation.
That's why I came to this. I started doing that calculation and I went, we've got a lot more than 7.5 acres, and I realized it's developed. And
when you add them together, it's closer to like 17 or 18. I was
gonna say, but for developed recreation lands, it's much more intensive use.
Yep.
So you can have a much lower number per 1,000 people and sustain.
And the intention too is that the developed, and this is not true across the board, but developed parklands is more likely to be programmable with sports or with gatherings or with events or things like that that do build community. So there's some of that community aspect. There's absolutely things like that would happen or could happen on the natural areas, but you're not going to get the same bulk of people, the same variety of events. Like you might organize a full moon hike or something for 20 people, but you're not going to organize, youth soccer for 600 kids.
No, but they do cross-country races.
Sure.
In Red Rock. I mean,
I'm just saying the different, I'm just saying that part of the reason to draw a distinction between the two and having that they are both assets in different ways.
Absolutely. And the developed ones are more community focused, whereas the natural ones are more individually focused because you're going out into nature.
I think that's right. Yep.
Michael?
Yeah, I have a similar question. It's on the next page though, when we talk about that Wheeler Park and others are not developed park spaces. I mean, a developed park space is the part of the Wheeler House section that's developed.
Sure. The community gardens, the dog park.
The rest of the park is what I would call for passive recreation. And I'm, as a policy matter, I don't think we should develop parks. These parks are very important natural spaces, whether it be Red Rocks or Hubbard or Wheeler. They should be available for passive recreation, but not developed. We shouldn't be building stuff in them.
We're not necessarily saying take the things that we own now that are natural areas and build into them. It's more that there is a need for more developed park spaces, whether that's a little corner of a currently natural area, the way that the dog park went in at Wheeler, or if that means acquiring a different piece of property somewhere else and developing it and putting a playground and all of that. It's not necessarily developing the natural areas that we have. It's not that.
Okay, because we have Szymanski Park, Farrell Park, JC Park, Baycrest, the little one. Those are all what I would consider developed parks, because you can play sports there. And
right. So we need more of those in more appropriately distributed.
And there's going to be another one in South Village, if I understand correctly. Well, at least there's going to be a field.
Small one, yes.
And I think that this is exactly the point Laurie was making, you know, to make sure we have goals for both. Yes. So you're not just going to take Red Rocks and build the mega playground because you're missing a playground, you know.
Yeah.
That making sure we're.
But I'd like that to be clear that we're not going to develop these the parks that we mentioned, Wheeler and Red Rocks and Hubbard, because they're beautiful as they are, and yes, keep up the walking paths and so on for passive recreation, but that's it.
Okay, anything else on this, or are we ready to move on to the natural resource?
Yeah,
Mike?
I had one more question, unrelated to what we were just talking about.
Let's finish up Michael first, and then we'll move to
and that is on the third paragraph, we talk about the use of the conservation fund, which was expanded to allow up to 5% for maintenance. I think it's actually 50% for maintenance for 10 years.
You're right.
Right? And that at the end of the 10, or over the 10 years, or at the end of the 10 years, the loan is repaid into the conservation fund. And so I think we need to be sure that we understand that that's temporary, and that at some point we're going to budget for it separately, a separate budget item that's not taking money from the conservation fund, which was intended to purchase land.
I think 5% might be able to be used for maintenance.
Right. So there were a few amendments.
That's where the 5%.
One is 5% perpetually. The council can assign to maintaining any natural area. In addition, the voters created a 10-year period during which investments in improving 3 major natural areas can be at what is now Hubbard, Red Rocks, and Wheeler. Yeah, and that's time limited. But the 5% is a perpetual authority.
I would argue that should be a budget item in Parks and Recreation, not coming out of the conservation fund. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Well, voted on.
Conversation.
It is what it is.
It is what it is, but
yeah.
I'd like it to change. I mean, you know, I'm not the same guy I was yesterday.
I'm not saying it can't change. I think we need to make sure it's written right.
We have now.
Might I suggest that that the policy level question that you're saying is invest both in maintenance and acquisition?
Yeah,
because the plan really doesn't identify the source. It identifies the need and the action, not necessarily the exact financial mechanism.
Yes, but I think we ought to understand the intent. The original intent of the conservation fund was to buy space, to buy land, and we changed it for good expedient reasons, and now I think we could change it back for good expedient reasons. As a matter of policy, let's use that fund for buying land, which was what its original intent was. And if that's a policy, then shut up now.
I think that changed a couple of times.
Okay, so a few from the audience, if you state your name for the record, Mike.
Mike Simonell. I'm chair of Rec and Park Committee. What of course, there's never enough money. Okay, you can put something and say, okay, go out and budget for it, but even with the money that's being sent from the Conservation Fund to Rec and Parks, there is not enough money that's being directed toward the maintenance of our existing parks. So, which leads me to maybe offering the thought that you may want to make a distinction between parks and natural areas. A park is a place where you want people to recreate. A natural area, less so, more private experience. So our committee has spent some time talking about Hubbard a little bit lately, and there's a bit of a process that's going on right now where the original task force vision for the park, which included a public building that would have hosted events.
I remember.
That vision may never be realized, but you know, that was going to bring people to Hubbard. In the absence of that building being there, you've still seen other activities. You've got the ag activity for Common Roots. I believe part of the next phase may integrate some type of recreational, child recreational amenity that could end up being in there on the north side of the park. But I would say that our committee looks at our parks as places where we feel that our mission is to provide opportunities to our citizenry to recreate, as many as can be. That's the purpose of a park. Now, if you want to have a natural area where you want to limit because of the sensitivity, that's understandable. But I would say that the disposition of our committee with regard to Hubbard would be that we would like to see how that facility can serve more people in our community, not so much active recreational, not contemplating soccer fields and the kind of activities that you see at Veterans Park, but we would like to see more people. It's a tremendous asset. It's right in the midst of several neighborhoods. It has a lot to offer, and you know, there's just so many people again who are underserved, and that's a long ways to go, and maybe they're not going to quite get there unless CCTA is going to, you know, start bringing people into that area, and I doubt that. But facilities like that really should be serving our citizens as much as they can be. That would be my opinion, and I think that most of the folks on our Rec and Park Committee feel that way about our parks.
And do you see Red Rocks as a hybrid that has both natural and recreation, or do you see it as a park? In your definition?
Well, I mean, I see it as a park for starters, but there are plenty of parks that have elements that you know, warrant less use, protection. I mean, you can marry these things. I mean, everything's different. You just have to make the effort, you know, to try to figure it out.
I can imagine events that the city could have an event like teach people how to cross-country ski, for example. There you could get, you know, a huge number of people, excuse me, to do that sort of thing at Hubbard.
Hubbard's perfect
for it. You know, it's a bit tougher in summer because it has a big wetland down the middle, but yeah. No, snow.
It's harder to do that in the winter, in the summer.
To use, I mean, it's harder to use in summer because part of it you can't really go through. It's a wetland. But yeah, that kind of thing, lovely.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to offer that.
That's great. Okay.
Yeah, Ryan Doyle. If we look at the last line that says strategy for this section, it talks about Parks Master Plan to assess existing and needed park space and access to each from throughout the community. And I think if we look at Lori's and Mike's comments, there's this discussion about types and uses and or a spectrum of what parkland can be. And I think it would help address some of this discussion to put that right into the strategy for the master plan to allow whichever body, if that's Mike's or yours, to first take a look to start to dig into that topic a little bit more and be really empowered to do that right from the get-go.
I mean, natural resources has a stakeholder interest in,
Sure.
in this conversation.
Paul Engels, do you have your hand up?
Where's that mute button?
Sometimes it's hard to find.
Lost the button.
Sorry, no.
If it's no, you
Just
can
took me
shake
a while
your
to
head.
get to the mute button, that's all.
Okay, well, no, you can shake your head. I'll be watching if it's
Okay,
putting you on the spot.
I'll wave my hands frantically, okay?
Okay, good,
Okay.
perfect. Okay, then I guess we can move on to the next section.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next section is natural resource protection and conservation.
Mhm.
You wanted to start out with a little intro?
Yeah, I'm just pulling up my moving documents
Yeah,
around.
we're a little behind schedule, but
That's
not
okay.
too bad.
Yeah. So I just wanted to set this up a little bit. There's a lot of information in the section itself, and there's a lot of what I'm about to say in that sort of intro to the section. We were sort of framing natural resources a little bit differently in this plan, and not differently in a way that it's never been framed before, but sort of just making express what has been included in other plans or other documents. We were considering sort of two different types of natural resources, kind of landscape level natural resources and resource level resources, which is a little circular to say, but out loud. But it sort of draws a bit of a distinction between the value of a natural resource that is on sort of this broader, like to the benefit of the landscape level versus a sort of resource level, like it's needed for water clarification, or it's needed for stormwater, or it's needed for wildlife or flood resilience or whatever it might be. So we wanted to talk just a little bit about talk about all these natural resources things, but first of all, point out that we need to be talking about natural resources in the frame of our vision and goals statements. It's just the nature of this process that we're talking about each of these sections as individual sections. What's going to be a big task for this group, especially once we get into sort of June-ish, May, June, is to be starting to knit all of these things together. So the commission and the city council and the city as a whole has done a lot of work to protect natural resources in the city. And there are a few bits and pieces left, and Paul has some maps that he can share showing some of these things. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody was in the mindset of keeping those vision and goal statements in mind, also keeping the other topics and other priorities that the city has in mind. Just that the natural resources are part of the really a lot of overlap between other priorities that the city has for housing and for recreation and for economic development and all of these other things. And that, and now I'm repeating myself again, I think, but keeping in mind it being inclusive, fair and just, being climate resilient, being human focused, and being opportunity oriented, just when you're thinking about policies that are included in this draft. This is a good time to share maps.
If you like.
Sure.
Are
Thanks for
those,
coming, Mike.
are those maps gonna show the 51% and 41%, that kind of stuff?
The maps are a little rough, but yes.
They're going good. I'd love to see those.
These are
Is
sort
it
of
okay to look at the maps first?
Yeah.
in process. As noted, we are not the GIS professionals that we are going to be
Oh, come
working
on.
with. But we can make some visual statements with our mapping. And when I say we, I mean Paul.
Paul's ability has skyrocketed over the last
wow.
many years, I must say.
Jessica's
That is-
impressed.
I'm impressed.
Okay, so fingers crossed that we don't crash the system here. And because we are using a fascinating service called Amazon Web Services for our GIS now, which
Weird.
is really cool, but it means that this computer is now running 2 computers and a Zoom meeting. So we shall see what happens. I'm gonna run through this really quickly. And really my objective is to give you a little bit of a flavor of where we're at. And if there are things or subject areas that draw your attention, these are some things that as we talk with the GIS professionals over the next little bit, we can dive a little more into. But I'm going to give a quick sort of like snapshot of where we're at and how it looks compared with some broad resources that we have. So what's up on the screen, I can move up and down, but just for the purposes of having this be somewhat visible, I'm not showing the whole city because unfortunately South Burlington is shaped the opposite as all televisions.
It's portrait.
So keep in mind,
We can do this.
right. Keep in mind, South Burlington also includes this great tail that's part of the Belter Farm. It's a 100-year floodplain. Every map will show this green, so it's mostly going to be cut off up there. So what you're seeing right now is this is a approximate compilation of our current areas that we would consider to be conserved through regulatory tools like the Natural Resource Protection or District or habitat blocks or the floodplain areas, river corridors, land that has been conserved by a third party with the exception of Eau Claire, which doesn't show up in this map because our data is a little bit old.
And parks.
And parks with the exception of Hubbard Park because our data is a little bit old. But this is a reasonably good snapshot of what is considered in some form conserved. The other piece that it does not show is areas where we have the mandatory conservation PUD where 70% of a given parcel must be conserved, but that's.
So
I'm gonna turn on a layer and then I'm gonna turn it back off because the data is really pretty messy, but this sort of aqua turquoise blue are showing wetlands. So we also protect class 2 wetlands and 100-foot or 50-foot, depending on the circumstance, mostly 100-foot buffers, class 3 wetlands. This data is mapped site by site, and so take this with a pretty deep grain of salt, but it does show, it rounds out the picture a little bit more also. So that's our current situation. I wanted to overlay this with some other piece of information that we have. So I'm going to start with, hold your breath, hopefully this works. Under here now is the state BioFinder, matching what Kelsey just spoke about. The BioFinder looks at species level and landscape level elements. So this is done on a statewide basis. You will see that very little new popped up, and that is a representation of the fact that South Burlington has largely prioritized those areas already. It's not 100% match, but there's not a lot that shows up in this map that isn't already in the species level map, and that shouldn't be a surprise after all the work that you've done over.
There's also, if you notice, there's a little pink circle kind of at the end of the airport. That is because of a rare species mapping, which they don't pinpoint for purposes of people not knowing exactly where it is. So it's, yeah, right, exactly.
But it is regulated through Act 250 with the airport.
It's regular, yeah, there's one over by Red Rocks too. So those are regulated areas. It doesn't necessarily mean that the whole area is covered in rare species. It's just a buffer area.
So I'm going to switch now to the landscape level. So this is again the BioFinder. And the landscape level shows a lot more sort of connectivity. You'll see that the data is more jagged. That's intentional at the state biofinder layer level. So you'll see going left to right across the screen is the Potash Brook. Over on the right-hand side of the screen, a lot of that black line is the South Burlington-Williston line. That's a lot of the Muddy Brook area. This big blue splotchy area is part of the Muddy Brook, and you'll see in a minute that is also part of what is now the Muddy Brook Wetland Reserve, owned by the Winooski Valley Parks District and land that the city had acquired. And then you see the Great Swamp here in the middle. There's also areas near the outlet of the Potash Brook down by the Queen City Park area. Lastly, you'll see again, this whole northern part of the city, the area of where the Muddy Brook lets out into the Winooski River. And then over on the left-hand side near Burlington is the headwaters of the Centennial Brook. So again, sort of bringing in our data. It's not a perfect match, but you see that the areas where the city has put in regulation over at the Muddy Brook area and or it's been acquired by the Winooski Valley Parks District, there's a fair amount of overlap. It's not entire. There's certain areas down in the southeastern part of the city where there's a little bit of these landscape level corridors that have been identified. I think as we dig into the data, we will find that our picture is a little more robust in terms of conservation than even this shows, because sort of site by site through development review, there's more areas that are protected in there. I thought that one area that I would just like to highlight briefly, because I think it was an interesting example, is this little green strip in here, right there, is something that you had put in a year and a half ago as a habitat connector, identifying places where two mapped habitat blocks should be connected by a resource. And that matches up pretty nicely to what the landscape level objective is set. Now we can talk about widths and things like that, but the areas are pretty well aligned, which I thought was a pretty neat thing to show, to find out. Let's see, what was next on my list? This is sort of just an interesting observation, but this is the 2016 comprehensive plan underneath here. There's a lot of colors showing up in here. This is the future land use map of the 2016 plan. You'll see that most of the areas that have this sort of fuzzy green don't really show up because, again, they're areas that the city has already taken action. There is a little bit of fuzzy green that shows up sort of through here and up here. And these are lands that are typically agricultural lands owned and operated by the University of Vermont. And so this is a discourse to continue to have with them. This, for example, is the Court Farm. This is the Wheelock parcel where they do alternating, leaving it be fallow and then growing corn and hay for their the Miller Farm cattle herd. So I think that those were most of what I wanted to show you and really let you get into the rest of the discussion. Oh, no, the one that Lori asked about or was really interested in. So let me give me one more second here and turn some stuff off here. Commissioners who've been on for a little while did see a version of this map not too long ago. But this and this, nope, this and this. I'm going to zoom out a little bit on this one, if it'll let me. So very broadly speaking, the purple on this map we have used as a proxy for land that is built upon. Doesn't mean it's fully built out. It's just land that there's some very specific metrics that we put into it. It's basically parcels that are under 4 acres in size, period, which is a little bit of an arbitrary number, but it represents something that somebody might say, oh, there's a large piece of open land versus not. Or land that is larger than that and is more than 10% covered by buildings or pavement. And 10% is, again, a little bit arbitrary, but it captures areas like the airport that, you know, is nobody would disagree is developed, but it's not. There's a lot of green, there's a lot of grass on the airport, and but nobody would call that undeveloped. Right. The green is the inverse of that. So it's parcels that are larger than 4 acres and less than 10% impervious cover. So that's that, roughly speaking, division of the broad categories of built, unbuilt, built, and then we can talk on the unbuilt about conserved versus unrestricted, that 8%.
Yeah.
So of the total land use, there's about 88% that would be considered broadly to be completely unbuilt, that is eligible for development under our current regulations.
What was that percentage again?
8.
8. Oh.
Yeah.
So that's what
80.
No, 8.
Yes.
Would you scroll up so I can see the north end, and then
sure.
so I can see the south? I just want to see how it completes.
So up at the north end here, this is obviously the Belter farm there. Over to the right of that is land that is, some of it is Winooski Valley Parks District, some of it is wetland complexes. This is UVM Centennial Woods. This is the large property that's behind the Windjammer. And that is a habitat block. And I can show it now with this over top. Nope, I have to do it the other way around. And we'll see if we crash the system here or not.
Go.
And I'll put, so this is our zoning tools here. I'm going to zoom in just so that it's a little hard to read otherwise. And I just realized that I put the color of conserved land the same color as developed land in this map. So that's not going to help a ton, but give me 1 second here to switch this so that I can show you something useful.
He is getting good at this, isn't he?
Yeah.
And this is a new tool.
Fingers crossed. Okay, so this this is land that's conserved by a tool like it's association land, it's NRP, or it's a public park. So it overlaps a lot with the other tools in there, but there's a few other things in there also, like if the village at Dorset Park neighborhood has a large open space that is theirs privately, then that would also, we would call that conserved because they've used up all of their density and there's deed restrictions on it. South Village is another really good example where they have, 100 acres of privately owned land that is unavailable for future development.
it includes the parks other than the ones that you say are missing.
Yes.
So the 8% is the extremely pale gray color.
Sort of
Yep.
So those are the areas that would be kind of
That's the hill farmer.
up for grabs, kind of. When
Yes,
it
and then
comes
of
to
that, this is some of our data work that we need to do, but of that, a good chunk of what's showing up in this map is also now off the table. So
Yeah,
for
that's
example,
Eau Claire.
down here, this is the Eau Claire farm and a big chunk of that has been conserved.
It's about to be conserved.
Well, some of it has been.
Some of it has, but the
Well,
rest
I
of it
think,
is.
And then
as
up
you're
here-
down there, we also have some other tools in place that probably aren't shown up, like a conservation PUD. Like we
Right,
have
yeah, that
areas
doesn't show up in there.
where, if someone did develop some of those larger areas.
And then up in here is what is the O'Brien neighborhoods that have been, that are either under construction or have been approved. So this is sort of off the table as whether it's up for grabs or not, which is what brings us down to 8% pretty quickly. And then, if you were to take the 8% and then assign some of that to being UVM land where they have no stated interest in, like the Hort farm and the Miller farm, that probably drops down a little further. So the actual amount of land that is currently as identified in the plan as available for development is pretty limited.
And is that the
greenfield.
cemetery?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is St. John Vianney Cemetery.
What you described as open farmland, shrubland, forests, and unbuilt commercial lots that are not presently restricted or regulated.
Yes.
Yes.
So
Yep.
all of those.
Yep, because when we look to land use designations, and I have a whole other map that can show that, everything is something as described in the aerial imagery that gets used. So if something is unbuilt, it could be buildings, it could be pavement. If it's not buildings or pavement, then it's going to be wetlands or shrublands or farmlands or forest lands. So that's that. Yes, it falls into that description.
I have a question. I don't think we should use the term conserved anywhere in here unless it's subject of a conservation easement, because they aren't conserved really, they're regulated.
Mm-hmm.
There's some regulatory protection on all this, NRP, habitat blocks, but we can't say they're conserved. Eau Claire is conserved, Wheeler is going to be conserved. But
do you have a suggestion of a catch-all description? Because Kelsey and I were having this exact conversation a couple days ago, and I appreciate what you're saying, Michael. And at the same time, for example, I'll use Red Rocks Park as an example. Red Rocks Park was purchased with the authority of the voters and uses federal land water conservation funds. The steps that it would take to undo the action of that would be many, 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 but in the classical definition of does a third party absolutely control it, the answer is no. But it seems also disingenuous to say that it's an unknown future there because—
No, but it's regulated in some way.
So you're suggesting maybe regulate or
Conserved,
just not using the word conserve?
Conserved for what's conserved, and it has regulatory protection, if you like.
So that's a little bit different than the example that Paul was saying for Red Rocks.
Yes.
Red Rocks has restrictions because of the funding source and because of political and the will of the political will of voters in South Burlington. I think the point that Paul was trying to make is that there are properties that are not legally in perpetuity conserved, but the hurdles are so many and so high to develop them that practically speaking, in any kind of functional planning horizon, they are.
So Red Rocks.
It's a practical versus a legal definition, I guess.
Yeah.
So Red Rocks would be a good one potentially to call conserved, even though it doesn't have a conservation easement on it. Whereas the other pieces would be called regulated or
have regulatory
protection.
Something like, I would agree with you, or something like the NRP. That's a zoning district, that's a regulation.
Habitat blocks.
Habitat blocks.
Right. But say Hubbard Park was purchased with the city's conservation fund. It is restricted by the choice of the voters. It would take the voters refunding that money to the conservation fund and then applying it to something else to develop it.
Right.
It's not regulated, but it is
it's conserved.
I think
I'm happy to use a different word, and if the guidance of the commission is to find something that it is a bit of a catch-all to mean it is within the planning horizon of what we could possibly envision, not—
Does protected feel right?
Can we use it's public?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
The homeowners association.
There are homeowners association, there's privately owned. There's land that's, the fee land is owned privately, but the conservation easement is owned by Vermont Land Trust or somebody that does not have public access.
No, I meant publicly owned, like Hubbard is publicly owned.
But we mean for an umbrella term above that. So we have publicly owned lands, we have privately owned and conserved lands. We have lands that are both public and private that are regulatorily restricted.
Yeah.
Is there a term that you like that is a catch-all for all of those things? Is the term protected something that feels right, or is that a little bit off?
I'm sensitive to this because of S100. We think we've got land that's protected right now, which can become unprotected in a heartbeat. Maybe the difference between an NRP land and say Hubbard, is that one allows limited development and the other one allows none.
Or, right, in that instance, one is under control of a public entity and one is private, it remains privately owned also. So.
It's one of those things where there's 1,000 ways to slice this group of properties.
We could use the two words it's regulated and it's protected. So it has some regulatory protection, all of those categories, because on your 51%, you've got NRP, you've got habitat blocks and connectors, you've got parks, you've got wetlands and their buffers.
Association land, like that is often includes those things, but not entirely.
That's the other problem, is that there are numerous lands that are more than one of those things, that are NRP, but are also in a habitat block, but are also publicly owned, but are also like you can have a piece of property that fits into all of the words that you're talking about.
Maybe you could divide it up by mapping a separate map for each of these categories of land.
So I think the point is there are some reasons why we might want to refer to the group of the protected lands, whatever you want to call them. We need a term
conserved and protected,
because we may want to refer to these as the like lands unlikely for development within the scope of the plan, you know.
Well, yes, of course, I agree. It's within the scope of the plan, but it also will direct the planning commission. It'll tell the planning commission what can we do and what can we not do. Because I think we had this problem with the maps in the old plan that we couldn't use them to guide us. We kind of abandoned them, or we had to. So I want to avoid that happening again. That's why I'm kind of sticking to the fact that we need to have maps that show what the land is in each category.
We can absolutely have that. It's some version of what Paul was showing before about here's the regulatory stripes and here's the sort of zoning stripes and here's the private conservation and here's the public lands.
I could see
there's some version of that. I guess what your original point was is that the word conserved is not appropriate for the umbrella for all of those things. I need a different word.
Okay. Would it be worth it to use permanently protected and currently protected?
So I think if you're all in agreement that this is something you'd like us to be able to, at a minimum, define so that it's explained as being that it is a compilation, let us work on that a little bit. Mm-hmm. The data is not at 100%, Michael, but that layer that I turned on of quote unquote conserved is actually 4 different layers that I just collapsed into a single color for the purpose of this conversation. Yeah, there is publicly owned, regulated, association, and third-party conserved, of which again, some of them overlap a little bit, but we do have this as different.
Maybe as far as maps go, to include in this plan, we could have a map that has NRP and habitat blocks as one category on one map. The other map could have parks and permanently conserved land, because they're kind of, you can't miss it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do that to a certain extent in the current plan. And I think that there's no reason to do that. The only thing I would say is let's make sure that also when we're mapping that we are not just telling the story of who we are, but the story of who we want to become too. Yeah. Because what is zoned NRP today may be modified in the future. You may choose to add or modify areas in the future. And I wouldn't want the plan to imply that is unchangeable in either direction, including growth. So I think we want to make sure that that map is describing a snapshot in time.
As were the others way back in the previous plan. We couldn't.
And Jessica, I think Paul's trying to get your attention there.
Paul Engels?
Yes, just a quick question. Paul, how many acres is the city totally?
10,600, I believe.
10,600.
Unless you agree with the census description that has us owning about 1/10 of the lake, in which case it's a lot more.
Okay. Do they have us owning the lake or not?
It's unclear.
The 10,000 doesn't include the lake, right?
It does not. It does not. It
Was
does
that-
include streams, but it doesn't include the lake.
Was that ever resolved about Juniper Island and about over to Winooski River?
It's our understanding that is not our, it doesn't belong to us. That's what has been resolved. Whether it belongs to somebody else or not is an
It's still under question.
Not ours.
You won't be arrested for trespass if you go on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering, if you use like the word conserved, can you put a footnote and down below and say, these maps show what this is? And then later on, if the maps change,
yeah,
the footnote changes.
I think a question when we come back to you is, this map has been a planning tool to date, this conserved layer. I guess a decision point for you when we next talk about this is, do you want to include it? If you choose to include it as a map, then I would 100% say yes, we should have a discussion about what that means in there, so that we're not doing guesswork in 5 years. But you may choose to say, it helped us tell a story of how we got here, but it's not a map, it's not a layer we're going to actually include in the plan.
I think
yes, I agree.
he's also saying that it would
word.
define the word.
Define the word
Like the word conserved is asterisk as shown on map.
Yes.
or with such and such layers.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Paul, since you're so good at maps,
Thank you for the compliment.
we've got this section in here that talks about, however, all open lands do not have to be earmarked for conservation. Some in the built area might want to be conserved, and some in the, to say, some currently unbuilt areas should remain unbuilt, but some may be suitable for development. It's sort of, it would be wonderful to see what in the unbuilt land is considered to be suitable for development,
And what's
and what's in the developed land that seems suitable for conservation, so that we could see what that looks like. Is this?
Well, I think that's the key, to me, that's the key ultimate question of the plan.
Yeah.
Is the future land use map should answer that question of, after you've culminated all the information about all the different priorities of the city, what do you want to do with the land? And some of the questions are fairly straightforward, like if it's the Shaw's Plaza, probably want to see that more intensely built in some way. Might want to include parks, but other areas that would be considered unbuilt. And I think that this was, you know, where Kelsey started the conversation is, how do you want to go through the decision metric of a parcel of land next to us here at City Hall in the core of City Center, you know, maybe go back 3 years in time because now a lot of it is built, but in a site like this versus a site that might be off Cheese Factory Road.
Yeah.
And a lot of those decisions, and the reason I was starting with this map, a lot of those decisions have historically been made, but there are some remaining to be made.
So when I read this paragraph, it brings to my mind that you guys have some idea of which these lands are.
Sure.
And if you could give me a map that I could look at and go, oh, these are the built areas that you think ought to be that are possible areas for conservation, and these are the unbuilt lands that are possible areas for development, then I could visually look at it and go, that makes sense. Or what about this? So I don't know if there's a way to give us a visual for that.
I think we can do that. I think that this is also a dialogue with you. So we can give you some starting points with it. I think the climate action plan and some of the initial work in the objectives talked about using the transit overlay district, quote unquote, as a bit of a proxy for that. The transit overlay district is where bus transportation is. So it's probably not, it's close to being the right place, but it's not fully representative. And then as Kelsey and I have looked at, you know, I think that there's a couple of areas of the city that are, could fall into either category. And I think that's a subject of some discourse for you all about, you know, being clear about in this plan, what's your intent.
That would be, you could use both the transit overlay district and the urban design overlay district. They're kind of similar.
Yeah, there's the challenge with both of them is that, for example, the transit overlay district cuts halfway through the Chamberlain neighborhood because it's mapped as being a quarter mile from a bus route. So, one street is in, one street is out. Other than this map, they're exactly the same. But we think that there's something that could represent sort of the core areas of the city versus the not core areas of the city.
Because I made the same note as Laurie that I would like to see on a map those unbuilt areas that should remain unbuilt, and the others which.
I was asking for the opposite.
Yeah.
Right.
The unbuilt areas that you think might want to be developed, I'd love to see. Because
and the
it'll be a smaller portion, and
but we should have these things on
I just want
a
map to start with, so I can then have something to work from and say, no, I want to add this and I want to delete, so we can all do that.
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. If you would like us to fast track that piece of it a little bit, we're happy to have that so that it is part of in your heads as you're thinking about natural resources, you're thinking about housing, economic development, and how ultimately that question is, how do you balance the want and need for park space, natural areas, housing, new housing, and new jobs. It's, those are the four legs of the stool, essentially.
That would be fabulous for me.
Do you, like, when did you think that would come back? So right now we're doing like an initial look at all these different sections for some initial feedback. Do you think that would be like immediately following?
I mean, essentially, I think what you're asking about, Laurie, is a version of the future land use map. Which is, to me, that's the culmination of the plan.
That's where we're going.
We have a lot of it, frankly, from what, this mapping this evening, a lot of this is fairly laid out, maybe not on the subject of intensity within built areas, but in terms of build or don't build. I think we were thinking of sort of late May, early June to bring that, but if you wanted to accelerate that, to have that a little more front and center, we could take a first crack at it.
We would have a sort of first look at future land use. So our first look at, instead of being sort of topic related sections, it would be sort of geographic sections. You would be getting those sections as a first draft, actually, for the first meeting in May.
Oh, okay.
And then the sort of updated version of those sections would be the first meeting in June 13th.
So maybe we set as a target that we give a rough version of the map for that May meeting.
That would be awesome.
With the request that it is truly a first cut at map. And so our hope is that you will say how you want to change it. It will be pushed and pulled and torn. The tricky thing about mapping is it always looks so final. And so we want, we're happy to put something out as long as you're happy to own changing that.
I want it as a working document.
Well, great. We also want to look at the schedule. I think at the end of the meeting here, I think there were a few commissioners that were going to be out that meeting. So,
but that time frame that can get us started.
That was the approximate.
I do think it makes sense.
Yeah, things can definitely be moved around, especially at that point.
Okay. Are we ready to kind of look at the text?
One more piece in the working lands, or in this section, the last paragraph. Which is talking about the working lands. And I would really like to see us somehow state the importance of protecting these few remaining working lands. We talk about that we have them, but they're getting to be pretty precious.
And I should say, I gave 4 legs to a stool. That is the 5th leg to the stool, because it is a natural resource, but it is not a undisturbed natural resource. It is
it's the working
very much using that land.
And so I would love to see somehow that being stated as a priority.
Okay.
An objective.
What's that? It could be up in the objectives, yes. To conserve the working lands.
Michael, you were saying you had some comments here?
No, I'm done with this section.
Move on to the next thing.
Moving through. Next comments. As we move down, we're still in the natural resources.
Natural resources.
Was yours about the natural resource section?
Oh wait.
Okay, then landscape and background. Anything in there? Okay.
Oh, I did, Michael, when you were talking about the Champlain Sea sands stuff, would you like something added into this section here? A sort of geological history background stuff?
Yes,
Okay,
that's where, yeah.
great.
Okay, resource extraction.
Well, before we get to resource extraction, climate change. Nice little paragraphs, I love them. I would really like to see at the introduction to our plan, a conversation about climate change and about the importance of what's ahead of us and about the whole overarching focus of our city plan moving forward needs to have this issue as the overarching umbrella for everything that we do.
So it does.
We're ahead of you.
You're ahead of me? That's in there
yes.
already? Okay.
So I don't know how ahead of, well, remember the 4 goals?
Yeah.
Yes.
We did put it as one of the 4 goals.
Okay.
So the intention of the four vision, so we haven't, let me back up. I have not written the introduction to the plan because that's sort of the gathering the pile exercise at the end. What I think Jessica is saying is that the vision and goal statements that were worked through with the Planning Commission, with City Council in last summer and fall, and landing on this climate resilient as being one of the 4 vision and goals is exactly what you're saying, that the vision and goals are intended to be principal level, principal LE level, statements that are running through every section of the plan as we go. So absolutely, if you run across a section that I'm talking about and you don't think I've said enough about climate change mitigation, or we need more recreation lands because of more of climate, you know, whenever you see it, you're like, we need more climate, let me know.
I see it throughout the whole document.
Right.
In the heading, I would love to see expressly stated the existential challenge, both for our community and for our species.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
I
a
think
great
it has to be
idea.
really,
We were thinking
in red
that-
letters, unfortunately.
Lori is saying it has to be priority 1, 2, and 3, because we haven't prioritized the 4.
Right.
Which is the same priority.
The
top
climate
3
action should be priority 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Yes.
Okay, well, we didn't
know.
decide on that. We decided on 4 separate ones.
Exactly.
Well, and the way we're conceiving of this is.
And that was before I was here, so I'm sorry for not knowing that.
No, it's actually really good to like make sure that, you know, we're on the same page, and we hadn't talked about the structure of the beginning, so like.
Right, and as a piece of historical fact, the current plan has 4 goals in it. As order of action, the idea of having 4 sort of punchy goals was at the very end of the last plan for, I guess, Jessica might have been the only person who was there then. And so there's not a lot of discussion of them throughout.
Yeah.
This plan is embedding them throughout, but then also I think related to that, we were envisioning that in an introduction, it would have a discussion of what these 4 things mean.
Yeah.
So, you know, climate change, the crisis, all of that, you know, articulated clearly, and we can pull it straight, frankly, from the climate action plan on the inclusive, fair, and just. We've heard so much in the input of this plan about wanting to build a sense of place, a sense of community, and you know that South Burlington, the residents want it to be more than the sum of buildings and roads and parks. That they want a place, a community, a place to live our lives. And so talking about that as what that means is also you know, in the same. In a parallel to talk about, to have a little discussion of that.
And the other thing that I would say is the 4 vision and goal statements read as if one of them is climate resilient. To me, they actually are all 4.
They are all 4 climate.
Related to climate. One is direct climate resilience, and the others are building community, being more inclusive and equitable with our communities, having more justice and democracy in our processes. Being more opportunity oriented, we need to be collaborating region-wide and statewide and sort of multi-statewide nationally. All of these things are either they're indirect versions of ways that they're not necessarily direct mitigation like some of our energy policy might be, but it is mitigation of the sort of after effects or the extended effects of greater interpersonal conflict or greater issues with denser housing. Like there's all these things that can come up that are all will be sort of more necessary into the future than they've ever been, at least partially because of climate change.
We recorded that if you want to take that exact
Just done, I wrote the introduction.
And I think in some of that preamble, there's some wording in the IPCC reports
right
that can really be useful to
right. And we do have a really good starting point from the climate action plan that pulled directly from the IPCC reports. Obviously not the most recent information that just came out 2 months ago, but yes. Great.
It's getting to be a bigger issue, not a smaller one.
On also landscape and background.
Just under working lands where there's the objectives that are blank. And maybe that's where we want to add protecting our remaining working lands as an objective.
Yep. Yeah, the objectives being blank is I just wanted to make sure we were all sort of in reasonable agreement about the policy statements before getting sort of deep into that. So.
Okay. So can we go back?
Yep.
Jumped up past mineral extraction.
We did, yes.
So I consider topsoil to be a resource.
Sure.
And I think that we need somewhere to be saying that we don't want topsoil removed from the city.
Okay.
I think when developments start, they push all the topsoil to the side so that they can put in the utilities. But I think some of that topsoil goes away. It doesn't remain on site. And I think if we can say something about topsoil being a resource, it should be somewhere, maybe here.
Yeah.
Just to stay.
Needs to stay.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, the soil health has come up a couple times over the last few years, but I don't know that it's addressed in here. Not only not trucking it out of the city, but also maintaining its quality.
Yeah.
I don't know. We just want to make sure. I mean,
it is a
talking
resource.
about topsoil as a resource. It could be in here.
Yep.
Where
Yep.
okay. Anything else?
That might even be under the section coming up, which is soils. Yeah, the soil section down under community gardens.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Well, I mean, I think my understanding of what Fran was saying is it's both health of in situ soils, but also there are operations in the, not just development, you move it over and you move it back, but there are situations where it's scraped off and taken to the suburbs or somewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I thought we had some kind of control over that in the rules governing construction.
Whether they are or aren't in the rules, it's the policy statement about
right.
what you want to be saying about it.
So
Now, on the soil section, there was the soils of statewide importance. Very little is prime ag, and for that reason, the city should explore how to avoid developing unbuilt prime ag soils for uses other than agriculture. Wouldn't we then try to, as a matter of policy, call that the remaining ag soil as a protected resource, which can be used for agriculture only? Right now, we haven't included prime ag as a protected resource, even though there was a lot of back and forth about that, and in the end, it didn't get into the list of.
I guess what I'd say is I wrote this sentence a little bit more.
Just to get me riled up.
Vaguely has a negative connotation, but I wrote it a little bit more broadly to allow for flexibility and solution other than just regulation. Regulation and including something in the LDRs is one path and it's one opportunity. There are other things that can be done that I haven't even fully thought through all the points to do it. But I think Lori brought this up in a previous meeting. There's sort of, the classic, there's the carrot and the stick.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to make a statement in here about we want to shut down any development of any kind for anything on these things, to leave open the door for it being a carrot instead, somehow.
Mhm.
An incentive program or some other.
I mean, it may be a non-regulatory program altogether.
Exactly.
Just as with Eau Claire property, it's not a regulatory tool, it was a investment.
Which
Right.
one?
Eau Claire, city.
Maybe we would want the city to buy those properties.
I mean,
you know.
for example, if I'm not mistaken, the proposed football field at South Village is on prime ag soil.
At least part of it, I think, is true.
Chunk of it.
Yeah.
So.
Question is, how can you make that land more valuable as prime ag than than as a football field?
Well, yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make, that the remaining prime ag that we have has great value, has great agricultural value.
Yes. It says that, I think, is the point.
Does.
I think the point
Yeah, but
is she's not.
it says that, but it means we could build another football field on all the prime ag soils that are left. So it's not, we aren't protecting it in any way. You're just saying we should explore how to avoid. Well, how do you plan to avoid?
The interesting thing about writing a comprehensive plan or a municipal plan
It's
is
very difficult.
It's very difficult, first of all. And second of all, it in some senses actually asks more questions than it answers. So it raises, like, here are some priorities that the city has. Here are some policies that we want to advance. It doesn't necessarily go through step by step and say, here are all the solutions that we're going to be doing. So I don't think it's necessary in the plan to say, and therefore, like, say this sentence, and therefore we are going to prohibit development through inclusion in our LDRs. Like, I don't think that phrase needs to be included for this sentence to have some strength.
One other piece to add to that is, Michael, regulation is one way to do this, which is what you're saying. How do we add a regulatory line?
Well,
the other to think about is, this is harder to think about, but how can we incentivize the saving of ag resource lands? So I can regulate it by saying, don't do it. But is there something I can come up with to help
you could
create
regulate it by allowed uses.
You could do, there could be something, just spitballing, there could be a micro loan system that the city sets up that says, if you rent a portion that has prime ag soils and use it for agriculture, then you will get a forgivable grant, a forgivable loan for $10,000 or whatever it is. Like, there are,
Make
that's
it
just
so a
for
farmer can afford to actually.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that could happen.
I think this is the kind of thing that's going to come up a bunch as we go through the plan, that setting the policy objective, we might not want to be too narrow, because it might put blinders on, and versus like setting the objective, but allowing the mechanism of getting there.
How are we going to get there? We'll figure out later.
Yeah. I don't care how we get there. How we get there.
Well, and I think, a trick specific to prime ag soils is that it's a soil type, so they're sort of scattered in lots of places. And in many cases, that which remains are very valuable, like the piece of the Hubbard Park, where that's exactly the part that has been leased to Common Roots to farm, because it's the best to do that. Yeah. In other areas, it might be, a piece of land right along Shelburne Road surrounded by parking lots on three sides, and maybe the objective doesn't become conserve the entire thing, but put the community garden for the neighborhood on that piece. Right. But it may not be the objective may not be don't build on it at all, to your point from earlier, Lori, of where do we make these decisions? And I think that becomes sort of a little bit more of the nuanced challenge of something like this.
Where and how? Yeah. I mean, obviously, using an incentive is a lot better than in this case, than trying to regulate. Mm-hmm. But the incentives have to be potent enough that the neighborhood will want a community garden in this.
Right, well, and then I think the next level that we maybe are, I'm not sure how far we're gonna get into this plan, but I would envision a future plan talking the next level of this, which is after, even if it's not developed, doesn't mean it's being managed well. Right. So, you know, one of the great objectives that's come out of the Eau Claire purchase is a restoration of all that land. It was farmland, it will be farmland, but the way in which that is being managed is regenerative.
Yep.
And that's a whole other layer of this same subject area that we might touch on here, but you know, that's the next level of all of this.
I think we touched on it in the climate action plan that certainly city-owned community gardens should use regenerative agricultural practices. Required.
Okay, other.
I wouldn't belabor that one.
Other items on this section or ecological resources?
I got something on ecological resources.
Okay.
Someone can tell me to shut up if they need to, but down at the bottom of vegetation, and I think that I'd love to see this go up in the objectives, but down at the bottom of vegetation, they talk about no mow, may, and raise the blade campaigns for lawn maintenance. I would really like to see something putting in here to promote the Neighborhood National Parks Program. The Neighborhood National Parks Program is a program that is trying to get 50% of residential lawns in the United States turned into vegetative lands. It would create a 20 million acre national park and would have a huge environmental impact, much more so than no mow may, which is a great idea. But asking people to take half of their lawn and make it into vegetative habitat for pollinators and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is an established program that is getting foothold throughout the country. And I would love to see it, since we named No Mow May, which is also a national thing. I would love to see the it's called Neighborhood National Parks.
It's not lawn maintenance, it's lawn elimination.
So one of the things that I had noted in this section was, you know, because I think this is almost part of our next agenda item, like the idea of incentivizing people to expand natural buffers to all the different types of natural resources, because you know we have some amount of buffering mandated, but you know someone may have a property that they're mowing right now that's adjacent to one of those buffered natural resource areas that they could, you know, be great to like encourage exactly what you're saying, yes, kind of specific to those areas too. You know, maybe there could even be targeted campaigns for, you know, especially our you know, our impaired waterways and, you know, areas where it's even more important, you know, potentially.
What Laurie's talking about apparently has been done by a few homeowners on Brewer Parkway. They've converted the front of their garden that used to be lawn into a flower garden with pollinators and indigenous shrubbery.
Cool. Anything else in here?
I just had on the wildlife, you know, you've made a partial list. If you're going to make a list, you should probably do the lot rather than just some of it or none. So, you know, you should add, for example, coyote, beaver, and muskrat, which I've seen myself regularly. Mm-hmm. And we've not talked about the bird species that we have here, which.
So this list was taken actually from the Arrowwood report as a list that they listed as sort of indicator species of the size, mostly just to give examples of the size of mammal that we're sort of considering. You know, more or less the habitat blocks in South Burlington are not being managed for moose. They're being managed for sort of deer and foxes and things.
Plenty of coyote and now we have beavers.
Sure.
Again, and muskrat, it's quite small, but I had no idea until I actually saw them swimming around under a culvert.
I'm happy to include them in the list.
And then I don't know what you want to do about bird species, because we've got several classes. We've got raptors, we've got ground nesting and ground feeding.
Some birds, yeah.
We may be able to pull some of that from, it's a little dated now, but there was a 2005 breeding birds study in South Burlington. Presumably there's, the climate change is changing it. Presumably it's,
I mean, you know,
still.
I don't know. Well, we've got barred owls, we've got Cooper's hawks, we've got Shropshire hawks, and we've got red-tailed hawks, and
sure.
You know,
it may be valuable for us to also, as you talk about sort of reference links, to make sure that we are referencing that it wasn't just.
I wasn't just making up a list of animals.
Right, that there's a study from which this is drawn to that can elaborate further on that.
These are my favorite animals.
Okay.
So I included them.
Are we ready for water? We are running a little late here, but
I have not only one item underwater, which is under wetlands, which we should include the benefits of flood mitigation.
they do that.
Yep.
And you know, I think all of these have really kind of overlapping benefits as well. And I don't know if it makes sense to just kind of say that right up front, that they have benefits for climate change and temperature and flood mitigation.
I mean, in the intro for all of the
for the
surface
little,
waters?
yeah,
like
for the surface
up above.
waters, yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's something we talked about when we were kind of reevaluating natural resources.
And if it's not already stated there explicitly, but the water resources especially are the connectors at the landscape level in many cases in South Burlington. That was, you know, part of the research that we've done as part of interim zoning was this is the major way in which the habitat blocks are connected in South Burlington is through waterways, which are the most thriving ecosystems, and they are the connectors between areas where there can be messed up. So maybe just a connection back to the landscape level there.
Yeah. Do you think that it would make sense to say something about the culverts here? You know, we've talked a few times about how undersized culverts on those connections or blockages like create problems, many different types of problems.
I think that's a great idea. We now do have regulatory elements of it, and I think connecting it back to culverts, both from a stormwater management perspective and sizing them for climate change, but also for wildlife.
Yeah, because it's wildlife resiliency, flooding.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, now that you've sort of called it out separately, it feels like it's the level of one of these paragraphs. So it would be a standalone culverts paragraph that says all of those things.
Yeah, because the culvert conveys all of these types of water resources.
Yep. It's like it doesn't make sense to put it into any of them because it's all of them.
And a focus on any new culverts meeting a standard that really addresses all of those issues.
Okay, anything else on the water or anyone in the public on any of this up through any of the comp plan pieces?
On the aquifers and wells, we talk about salt, hydrocarbons, pesticides, fertilizer, herbicides are not listed there. I'm having a private, which I will make public eventually when I get there, conversation with somebody at UVM about the fact that they're using glyphosate all over the place here. I've done some work with the Rodale Institute to see, you know, how can UVM do this, what they want to do without using glyphosate to kill their cover crop. And there are ways of doing it. So maybe you should add herbicides in there because it gets into the groundwater.
Yep.
And all of us have a little bit of glyphosate in our blood.
And one other thing, if you're adding, should be PFASs.
I think we should also double check. I think, and you might know this, Lori, but I don't want to put you on the spot. I think Fire District 1 is now connected to the city system.
No,
it's not.
Fire District number 1 still is on its own water system. It does have a fire suppression connection.
So that is the connection.
There is a fire hydrant line that comes through Queen City Park.
Okay, but drinking water is well-based.
Potable water. So if our system ever failed, we could do a cross connection, but we are entirely our own water system.
Okay, great.
Does it seem, the naming feels a little ironic if the fire district isn't getting fire protection from its own system?
Well,
if the title is actually supplied by something else.
Fire district is an old name.
I know, I totally get it. I completely
and
get
it. It is for water as well as for fire.
Right.
And we do have a firehouse, which is totally non-functional.
Yeah.
By the way, Kelsey, on that same paragraph, health issues would probably be better to use health hazards. Just
sure.
No, I'm not supposed to say that.
Good.
Those are some awesome layers. Does the city have a plan to make those layers available on the website like BCGI does for the state data? Or is there a possibility of getting a folder for South Burlington put into BCGI?
We can look at some of it in the short term. Over the longer term, yes. So the city council approved this year putting a GIS analyst as a position starting next fiscal year. So that's something we are going to have the capacity to do more GIS work, and a big part of that work is the foundational data work. So yes, and it's not that it's not available now, it's just sort of messy in the extent of like, it's not especially usable because it's, it's been sort of compilations of two different things that meeting a proper GIS standard would be to do it a little more thoroughly, but that's a long-term goal for sure.
And is that something that's already been decided by the council as a future objective, or is that something
I think that's a layer below where the council's had conversation. They've invested in a GIS analyst is where we're at so far. I will say that what I was showing tonight, a big chunk of those layers are actually BCGI, pulled directly from BCGI. So like everything to do with the BioFinder is pulling off their server as we speak. I just happen to bring it into this project. So there's some level of South Burlington data that we would over time look to make available. Yeah.
Nice.
So yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next item. I know we're running late, which I apologize for, but this has been a really good, robust discussion. I'm pleased that we still have our city council chair in the room so she can weigh in if I miss anything. But so the idea on this next item is we have sent a LDR amendment to the city council. They've had some hearings. And they have sent a question back to us for discussion. And just as a little bit of table setting, because we have some new commissioners here who missed a lot of this whole discussion. So we have, in the past, when we've made some really big changes to the land development regulations, we have kind of made a commitment to like, within the year, kind of look at the feedback we're getting, issues that staff's having, where is there some things that are just really not working well. And this is kind of a case where we have kind of heard some feedback and we're trying to work on kind of some smaller, I guess you'd call fixes to some things that we had put forward and were adopted last year. And I guess what we're seeing is that as a community, we're really like pushing the envelope on some like new things where other communities in the state have not done this yet. There's not a lot of examples. So this isn't the first time that that's the case. So like when we did form-based code, a few years ago, like a lot of that was very, very new. There were very few communities. You know, we heard feedback, and in that case, we actually created a subcommittee to kind of look at some of those issues that were coming up. You know, this is kind of a similar thing where we had some really big changes to, in this case, our natural resource protection areas, including wider buffers than are regulated at the state level, at the federal level, or really anywhere else. So, you know, we're trying to kind of navigate, you know, we've done something that's kind of pushed the envelope, and now we're kind of hearing some things that didn't really fit well for some people. And so in July, we kind of heard about those things, had multiple discussions, and kind of made a decision to send those regulations to the city council. They've had some discussion, and you know, I think one of the things I was thinking is like, we don't have really a formal process in place for those tweaks. Like we make a big change and then we kind of collect feedback, but we don't really have a big formalized process. And it might be something that we might want to think about as a group, kind of a post-adoption adjustments, like what kind of a thing do we want to kind of tell the council when we're putting forward big changes that will kind of readdress things within a year, you know, just to maybe set some expectations. So we have these couple of adjustments. The council heard some comments, and, you know, I think Paul and Kelsey really laid this out really well. So essentially, you know, all the red and underline in here are the things that we as a group had approved and sent to the council for their review and possible adoption. The council kind of heard feedback from the community, and you know, felt like the area in yellow was something that they were considering for changes. You know, they felt like it was a little too narrow of, I guess, how landowners could deal with some kind of existing issues on their properties when it's in those expanded buffers. We hadn't really addressed that at our level. What we did was put in the exemption for, I guess it's not an exemption. So we had kind of expanded wetland buffers to 100 feet in areas. And we're hearing a lot of feedback that in small, like in areas that are kind of especially small lots, it was kind of a big deal for people to essentially lose the use of their entire backyards. You know,
not you lose
the ability to put new structures in and make adjustments, I guess is what it is.
So we said if it's half acre or less.
Yeah. But I think the idea was that there wasn't a great process in place for the properties that were larger than that. So it came up at the council level essentially that, you know, in at least one instance, in a specific example, but it, you know, it would apply to a lot of other properties as well. We hadn't really addressed, you know, I guess they have a question about what happens then on those larger properties in this case, where now we've expanded the wetland buffer. You know, what's the process for those properties? So that's the specific, you know, I guess question. So I don't think the idea was from council to kind of rehash everything, but to kind of think about.
Well, that part they are still in discussion on. They could discuss, but the question posed to you is that.
Yeah.
Now the larger, how many of the larger issues have been raised by property owners who have bigger than a half acre?
Well, I guess I would describe it, there's sort of two categories, and that's the yellow and the blue in here sort of talk about two different situations.
Right.
The yellow text, which is sort of an augmentation of what's already adopted, talks about how land that is already impacted in some form, it's already, you know, at one end lawn or at another end a building, to what extent it can be further, that it can be modified further. And so the standard that already was adopted last year was if it's already impacted, you can change the type of impact as long as it doesn't get worse. This yellow text would actually bolster it a little bit and give a little bit more clarity that you could look at the property as a whole and all of the impacted areas and sort of balance them out. So if you had sort of a parking lot here and you had a building here and you decide to add, replace your building here, but then your parking lot becomes a little smaller, like then on balance, you're making an improvement. That's one category. And there's a lot of those in the city because many areas that were within 50-foot buffers are now in 100-foot buffers. So there's a lot of pre-existing areas. The second category is what's in the blue here, and what was sort of the heart of, I think, some of the council discussion is areas that are maybe impacted a little bit, or where just outside of it is an impact, and what folks are looking to do is to stabilize a pre-existing condition. And that was the specific example that the Eastons brought forward. It's hard to know how many of them there are. We know we get stabilization discussions, especially along the lake, semi-regularly, but how many of those are also within a 100-foot wetland buffer, it's hard to know right now. So this language takes a shot at meeting what the council asked for, which was to provide a simple path for somebody to maintain a pre-existing condition. But that's also not a super simple statement, because there may be, there are reasons why something might not be entirely stable, and that's the sort of policy balance that council is leaning in a direction, but is, I think, wanted to have you have a little bit of discourse on. So to kick off that discussion, we put that language in blue to say this is how, this is a staff stab at how a simple statement could allow for maintaining a pre-existing condition.
Anything else, Helen, on that?
No, I think that sums it up pretty well. I think the bottom line, there was concern that the language opened the door to potentially other homes being built or wanting modification to a greater extent than the half acre. And that's what is the concern. I know Megan was very concerned, and I think she's on. I don't know if she wants to say anything more, but I think that was the issue for, we were sort of set to go, and then we started talking about this, and she raised the, well, maybe this is really bigger than it sounds. We're not just fixing a little problem, but we could be introducing many more, and that was not our intent.
So in that light, you might want to look at the yellow language, which provides a little bit of flexibility within pre-existing impacted areas. The blue language tries to be much more compact, to say it's only for the strict purpose of retaining a condition. So I think that the blue language is much tighter. The yellow language is broader and could allow for redevelopment of areas within there, but that's already adopted. It's a little bit tighter now. You might want to tighten it further, but also acknowledge that there's a bunch of areas in the city that are a parking lot within now a wetland buffer, and if we don't say any impact, then as defined under state rules, impact means touching it anyway. So you can't even convert a parking lot to something better than a parking lot. That's an impact because it's within a wetland buffer. So we were trying to allow for, consistent with state rules to say that improvements can be done. But that's the discourse.
And to that exact thing, the yellow previously was less strict, saying that redevelopment could happen provided the located area is of equal or smaller size. Whereas here, it also requires like a professional opinion by a wetlands scientist as well. Instead of just saying it's less, it's, you know, there's more analysis required, you know, in this case.
Can a the language of sort of non-conforming, where you talk about if it's non-conforming, you can't make it more non-conforming, you can't make it less non-conforming. Can that kind of language be used here to say, okay, you're encroaching on this buffer. If the 100-foot buffer is something that has been implemented because there's a real reason for it, then we want to not be encroaching further into that 100-foot buffer. If I'm restoring something and it means I need to expand further into that buffer.
Well, nothing allows somebody to, there's nothing in these rules that allows somebody to expand further into a buffer than is already impacted. So
if I'm doing, if I, in the Easton's example, and I have a lot of empathy for what you guys are dealing with, and their patio is having a problem, in order to fix that, a retaining
right, sorry,
wall
I should
needs to
say
be
not
put
nothing, in that, with that exception.
Right. A retaining wall needs to be put in. Well, that retaining wall is going to increase the encroachment, and it's on unstable soils that in itself may end up.
Right, so I should correct myself. Yes, for that blue language would create that exception to say if it's for stabilization purposes, then an additional impact could take place, yes.
So I understand why that language is there, and I have a concern about it. I don't know how to balance that.
Well, we did too. I don't know, Megan, if you wanted to hear from Megan or not. We can't see her little picture.
Yes, I think as soon as she speaks, she'll
I wanted to make
show
sure we
up.
were getting all the way through what was the question. But if Megan wants to.
Well, no, I wasn't forcing her to.
We're dealing with two things here. In the case of the Eastman's property, I don't think it's encroachment. It's that they have a serious problem, a threat to their home that they need to fix.
Right, but it is an encroachment because it's within a 100-foot buffer.
Yeah,
and it's not. It's a class 3 wetland. And it's a 50-foot buffer.
Right. Well,
according to this, anyway. The drawing that's in
the interest of full transparency to the specific instance of the Eastons, it's staff's interpretation that if that were redelineated, is almost certainly a class 2 wetland under today's rules. So we would have been proceeding as though that would be their result. It may be that we're wrong, but we were trying to be as fully transparent as we could be. So we think it's likely a class 2 wetland under today's definitions of class 2 wetlands, which would then bring in 100-foot, which would make any solution an encroachment.
So, I think to be broadly and also to be broadly addressing the issue of there are likely existing conditions that should be addressed that used to be outside the buffer with the old rules and now are in the buffer because we made the buffers bigger. So I think that not only the Eastons, I think there's probably other people who are in that category which we haven't addressed, where we've made the buffer bigger, but the lot is a larger size than what we've addressed. So I think that's what that blue language would do, would be to, you know, address those locations where there's erosion or an unstable condition for an existing thing, you know, so that maintenance, that needed maintenance could happen, you know, alleviate the erosion or, you know, whatever the exact condition is on the property.
Yeah. And
so we're not low oceanfront properties, and so we're not facing quite the kind of issues that they are. But if a buffer zone is being increased because there is a perceived hazard or need, and someone continues to build in that buffer and then the problem occurs, where do you draw the line and say, you can't build your house there because it's going to end up falling into the ocean again?
Or it's going to
be
flooded.
And it's like, well, you're taking my land. Well, I'm not trying to take anybody's land. I'm trying to protect the greater good. So it's a really tricky balance.
It is a tricky balance. And part of the discussion that got us to this point was that it feels very different to maintain and, or, you know, in this case, stabilize something that's existing. Feels very different than something new being put in. So, you know, this blue language, I feel like feels very reasonable to me. You know, it's a thing, it's in place, it's in danger of failing. You know, in the case of stabilization, there's often like soil movement, which would be moving and migrating into our waterways.
Without advocating for or against the blue language, one note that for you to your question, Lori, is that last sentence is specifically references that there's no exemptions to river corridor or flood hazard standards. Those are the areas that have been mapped and analyzed for hazard in terms of things falling into where a stream might move over time. So there is certainly a water carrying capacity, an ecological benefit. There's all sorts of benefit to the larger wetlands, but they're not the mapped river corridors, which have much more in-depth standards of review to make sure that there is not a harm taking place to the function of the river corridor. So if you happen to be in there, you have to meet all of those standards also.
And one last question, is the goal over time to have the encroachments within that 100-foot buffer go away? Or is the goal to have them stabilized and be able to stay there in perpetuity? Ultimately, are we wanting the encroachments into that 100-foot buffer to not be there anymore? In which case, what do you do in the way of stabilization? And is it stabilization if a patio is in danger? Is it a stabilization if the house is in danger? Where's the line for, our goal is eventually to have this be a buffer.
Yeah.
And if stabilization is something that can be done in perpetuity, it's never going to be a buffer.
Well, I think in general, we're not typically in the business of making people remove structures that already exist. So by regulation.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think in that case, it would be by incentive. Like, we haven't set a precedence of saying you've built something and we're going to come in and make you remove it by regulation. Like, that's not
no, but we,
like, unless there's a redevelopment.
But we do have, like with structures and stuff, if my house is a non-conforming house on a non-conforming lot and I need to change it or want to change it, the change has to make it less non-conforming.
Yes.
You can't make it more non-conforming.
And Lori, I would say to that point, that's essentially what the yellow language would do, which is to say, if you are further impacting, other than this stabilization, if you're further impacting an impacted area, that a net positive effect on the health and functioning of the wetland. You may tonight or in a future night want to look at that language more closely and say, is that where on that dial is this? You know, this is at one end of the dial where it says, you know, demonstrate an improvement. You could say, you know, demonstrate substantial improvement. I mean, you'd want to have language that the DRB can model, but I think to your question, that's the yellow piece there. An area is already impacted. You're looking to do something new to it proactively, not just restore a stabilization circumstance. So that's, but also I might suggest that given the council's timeline, this might be something that you want to dig into in a little more depth
at another time,
because there's a lot of great projects, municipal and private that are sort of waiting on this set of amendments for a bunch of reasons. And this might be a more in-depth discussion of what's your objective, but this is up to you. This is the council asks for your feedback and what do you want to do? If you have feedback, please go for it.
So, I think we need to know, you said there's only a handful, but it seems like there are more than a handful.
Of the stabilization ones.
Yeah.
Likely, yes, but I don't think that there's any way truly for us to know this.
Redevelop, I mean, we ought to be able to, a landowner ought to be able to maintain or repair something that they already have, not redevelop.
Right. Maintaining and repairing is already an exemption. So if you're just maintaining, if you have a parking lot that's in a wetland buffer and you're just resurfacing it, that you can do that. The yellow here is about redevelopment of a impacted area, and the blue is about stabilizing a pre-existing condition.
So the yellow, in the case of the yellow, and again, just to, now that it's up there, like that little part that's crossed out, that's what we sent to the city council. So
that's actually in your existing adopted.
Oh, that's in the existing adopted. Yeah, okay. So in the existing adopted, we just said, if you're gonna redevelop, make it smaller. Make them
right. And so the new language that was written creates the inverse of that, where it just says the naturally vegetative section is increased, which is the inverse of saying.
But it adds that second bullet where we're requiring an analysis, the applicant to pay for an analysis, which I know is one of the things that we had talked about not wanting to, we talked about the expense that goes along with that and whether or not it was something we wanted to do. And for some other instances, especially for the small lots, we felt like that was overly onerous and we had not recommended that for the small lots.
Right, but you might want to do it in a larger one because it could be a commercial site plan with a parking lot that they want to change it.
So I'm not advocating against it. I'm just saying, I know for the small lots, that was one of the reasons why we had written it differently, so that
but if it was only maintenance and repair.
Maintenance and repair is in a different section, completely exempt.
Okay, because we're dealing with two things here. We have a specific problem with the
right, and the Easton's challenge is that they can't meet the definition of maintenance and repair because in order to stabilize, they need to do something more significant than maintaining what they've got.
I got it, and I think we all, before we need to understand the threat, the problem that they have, and I think we need to have a site visit and look at this and to understand the problem, and then we can probably come up with a solution if we understand it clearly and can see what the problem is.
We don't typically
do site visits.
And the reason I say that is because I think it's our job to say, this is something that's going to apply across the city, across circumstances, across situations where there's erosion happening or, a stabilization issue. Like, I actually continue to feel like it's not appropriate for us to go to someone's house and say, let's fix their thing, because
that's not what I have in mind. So, I have in mind that it would help us understand this kind of problem, not specifically theirs, but there are others that are going to, and we're not going there to fix a problem. We're going there to understand what it is we're going to be confronted with.
Do you have an issue with the blue highlighted section that talks about stabilization?
No.
Why would you need it? I guess I'm just trying to tease out, what's the council's going to be revisiting this next week. So,
yeah.
I guess I just want to understand. I
fear
what would.
That's the reason I want to see this. I fear that that's been written for a specific circumstance, and we might want to make it wider than what's facing the Easterns. I don't, because I don't know what I mean. On paper, yes, I could see what it is, but. Or we already have a difference of opinion it's not a class 2 at this moment, so that doesn't come into it.
I think the challenge that we will have, as Jessica described, in being on the forefront of some regulations is that we're going to have to learn as we go with some of these. I don't think we're going to know all of the circumstances where an expanded buffer impacts a property until we face more of them. And we faced, a group of them in the past year, and I can probably say that we will see some more circumstances that we never contemplated the next year. I don't know that I've got a good way to help you identify more of them today or in the next.
So I hear Michael saying that his concern is that this language might be opening up a much bigger door than we are aware of. If this language gets adopted.
The blue language?
I'm talking about the yellow now.
Oh, yellow.
If the yellow language gets adopted and it turns out that it is actually creating an incursion into the 100-foot buffer that is greater than what was expected, can it be modified, or is that cat out of the bag?
So if you wanted to take, the yellow in our view is a little bit tightened over the current regulation. Because it right now just says redevelopment of pre-existing gardens, lawn areas. If you were concerned that today that there's a little bit of a barn door through that, we could potentially tighten that up a little bit further. One, I think, relatively straightforward thing that we could do is there's a mix in there of lawn areas and gardens and structures and impervious surfaces. There could be an additional criteria that said something like the net impervious area shall not be increased. So you couldn't, take a lawn, turn it into a building, and then have a smart ecological thing that was half the size of the building. You'd have to not have more impervious as the result of it. That could tighten that a little bit further. As I said, oftentimes these are areas that are parking lots that somebody wants to rebuild into something better than a parking lot, which is a good objective.
Yeah.
But if you were concerned that the yellow, and I shouldn't just really describe it as the yellow because it is an adopted regulation right now. If it's too wide, you could narrow it and see what comes up. That's certainly something we've looked at and had some debates about too. Is that too wide as presented?
And we have a bit of a tight timeline on this, is what I'm hearing.
So that might be a way to tighten it with, as I said, to have a net no increase in impervious within that area. And then, you can put it in your work plan as you did this year to further evaluate this whole, how's this going? Just as you've done with the form-based codes, you've done with inclusionary zoning, things where we push the envelope, we sort of have to learn along the way too.
And we are pushing the envelope in Vermont, but there are tons and tons of places that have 100-foot, 200-foot, and 300-foot buffers all over the country, and I can send you the list of them. So we're not an outlier in that sense, but we have to deal with the problems that we've created for ourselves.
Yeah, we hadn't. I mean, this was the one. I mean, are you saying you don't even want the changes in the yellow? You just want to keep it the way we had it before, where it's just a smaller size? I mean, because that
no, I don't think we should. I don't think we can, in all fairness, say you have to make it smaller.
Okay.
But Paul's, I think the impervious, not to increase the impervious surface would be a good way to describe it, to circumscribe it.
Would that be instead of having a wetland scientist involved?
I would recommend maybe in addition to in this case.
So add an additional.
But again, this is not the Easton's item. This is the many circumstances around the city where somebody wants to do wants to intentionally do something in a wetland, what is now a wetland buffer.
Yeah. And It obviously applies only to class 2 and or, so we don't have any class 1s, but class 2 because there aren't any expanded buffers on class 3 wetlands. It's 25 feet if I'm not mistaken.
It's 50 feet, but this standard applies to class 2 buffers only.
Yeah. So that's okay.
So it sounds like with this one, this piece, what we're saying is the recommendation to the council is to include the red changes. And then, is that true?
We need to, yeah.
And then also add an additional 3 that would not expand the impervious surface. So make it even, so as part of the council discussion, they made it more strict by adding the professional opinion by wetland scientists. And you're saying we're now recommending a second level of making it more strict.
Which don't, if it's a class 3 wetland, or it doesn't, we wouldn't require a wetland scientist, but if it's class 2, yes.
Right. And I should clarify, it is more strict in the standard, but it is slightly, it encompasses the entire property. That's the sort of adding of the S's to look at it holistically at the property. So it is both a little bit more restrictive, but also a little bit holistic, which somebody might say is more, not flexible, but I mean, presents more opportunities.
Jessica, are you suggesting that we'd add the third point would be relating to stabilization?
No. The stabilization is the blue, which is not on the screen right now.
But it's a whole new section.
Yeah, no, I was just talking about this. I was trying to finish the yellow part.
I think having the third one to say that we're not increasing the
impervious, yeah.
Okay. So our recommendation is to make it additionally more strict by adding language about impervious. Let's, does that seem generally like a good idea? Because I want to make sure we're getting all our comments before we do a vote. Okay, so it sounds like we're generally like that idea. Okay, so now the blue language is very specific to the stabilization. And the sentence at the bottom means that it's not encroaching into a river area. So in the case where there's kind of layered different resources, you wouldn't be able to go into a river or a flood hazard area.
And this change also strikes a prior amendment that you were proposing about allowing for retaining walls, because this would encompass the retaining walls. So it's sort of, that becomes redundant, and so just to be clear that that's.
On the retaining wall, I made a note for myself that would only be replacement or repair, not.
So anything that is repairing is already exempt. So as long as you're not changing the footprint, if you're repairing a retaining wall, you're already allowed to do that separately in the regulations.
Okay, so for this one, it sounded like, Michael, you were saying you wanted to make sure we had encompassed all the wide range of possible options,
well,
but
I know we can't because we don't know about some of them yet.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, like, is there an issue with this language, or does this seem like a reasonable solution for the Eastons, which was what the council asked us about?
Yeah.
So I did try to write this pretty narrowly. So you'll see that it's stabilization, but in a class 2, it's only more than 50 feet. So if you're less than 50 feet, like the classic wetland, you can maintain, but you can't do this stabilization work. It also allows it to be in, we have not come across a circumstance of a habitat block, but theoretically the same thing could exist. So we try to sort of balance being pretty tight, but also imagining a circumstance beyond the Eastons.
Yeah, I think in habitat, we've covered encroachment in habitat blocks already.
In a different, yes, this is again a stabilization. I don't know that I can think of a circumstance where that would happen, but the perspective that staff came at was all resources except river corridors and flood hazards, if it's for stabilization, would allow for this. So that's where habitat blocks came in.
Given that this is an ongoing process and we likely will need to revisit this again. This seems like a reasonable place to take a next step.
And Paul, any initial input? I'm going to open up for additional comments from the public too.
Nothing for me, no.
Okay, good. Yeah, you can shake your head. I can see you if it's a no.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Okay, anything from any audience members?
You want to hear anything from us?
Megan, you want to?
Sure. And I understand what Paul and Jessica are saying, that this is something that the council would be taking up. But my concern is that the exemption to those property owners who had not yet developed something in their backyard prior to November 10th, 2021, that if we exempt it, I don't know what quite could be developed there, something with a foundation, something that could potentially be unstable within years. So I just wanted to clarify, since Helen had raised my concern, and as far as the modification or this more narrow language on stabilization goes, I don't have a comment other than it opened my eyes to how these structures should not be allowed going forward, and that there needs to be more education in terms of how property values are enhanced by having wetlands in your backyard. It's actually something that is quite attractive. You are protected to have a nice view in your backyard. And it's also, I think, important for us to think about not opening people up to expenses in having to repair and do the stabilization. This is a big lift for homeowners. So I just thought I'd clarify, since Helen brought that up, but I do understand, Jessica and Paul, that this is something that the council will be taking up.
Anything else? Yep.
Did you want to hear from us to try to help you understand a little bit better what we're dealing with?
Only if you don't like what we're, I think we're ready to go with the language. Okay. So unless you
just very quickly, we bought the land back in 2007. It was a challenging lot to build on. In order to know what we were buying, we actually hired engineers from Civil Engineering Associates. We hired a wetland specialist to classify the wetlands. We did soil samples, core borings, to make sure that the soil on the property was good and was not the result, the steep slopes were not the result of dumping sites that New England had years ago, where they just used a ravine to dump stuff in. So once we found out that the site was buildable, and we went to the city and we worked with them for a long time. We went to Justin Rabideau in Public Works to say, we see how much water is coming down Holmes Road. We want to collect that into a stormwater runoff system, where it intersects our property. So we have various collection points that we actually collect stormwater runoff that we have paid for ourselves for our property. As Megan said, we have wetlands. So on our property, it's a little over an acre. But on that acre, we have wetlands, we have a stream, and we're very fortunate that we get to live on the lake. So we have lake frontage, and we have steep banks. So even though we have an acre, we have a very small defined envelope in which to build. And so that's where our house sits. And when they built the house, we had to do extensive site preparation that was done by qualified people. On that site preparation, there was provisions made for a patio on the north side of the house. That also is where there was a steep bank on portions of it. So what has happened is on that patio, because it was on a bank, we built a serpentine dry laid stone wall, stone sitting wall. It's not a retaining wall. It's a stone sitting wall that defines the patio and the bank so that you don't have people walking off the side of the patio and tumbling down the bank. About 15 feet down from the patio is where the storm water runoff collection system all comes out into what they call a plunge pool. And then it goes through a swale to the stream, all engineered by qualified engineers with the oversight of Julie Foley, who was over in Montpelier at the time. So the only point that I want to make is that when we did our project, it was done under the rules at that time. We paid a lot of money to develop our site. And we feel very fortunate that we have the wetlands because we like what they do for us. They're a buffer. They bring in wildlife, bring in different types of plant life and everything. So we like the wetlands. But the problem that we see with when you develop new regulations that are stricter than what was on the books at the time that the city approved a project by permit, for you to invoke those and then say, well, you can't do it. If you have something that's failing like our bank, and it's not a major problem, it's a slight area that's slumping, that's causing the wall to settle a little bit. And we have taken that down in part for safety to keep it from toppling over. But I don't think it's fair for you to say, well, we're gonna make the regulations stricter. So now you can't use your patio or you can't repair your patio. I think that you need to have regulations in place that allow people that have built on an approved site, have been paying their taxes all these years, to maintain their property. That's all we're asking to do, is to be able to maintain the property. We're not asking to expand or anything. And the rocks that we want to put in that some people call retaining wall, the people that install them call them stabilizing rocks to help stabilize a bank that is starting to slump. We're not looking to expand our usable area. All we're using the stones for is to try to keep that bank from further slumping. We built the wall once. We rebuilt it a second time when it started to settle a little bit. We built a third time. So the original 2 rebuilds, and it's still slumping. And the experts that we've had come in to look at it have said, the only way you can fix this is to put in these stabilizing rocks to be able to compact what that patio is sitting on. That's all we want to do.
Right, and when we did the work originally, it was done under the auspices of the legendary Ray Belair, who, if anyone knows regulations, Ray Belair knew every regulation. And we've always tried to cooperate. Paul has been very helpful. We even tried writing our own regulations, and we found out what a tough job that is. So, you know, we appreciate all the help we've gotten from Paul and from his staff. So
I have a quick question
for
you. It's a little, these folks have told you to put these rocks in and that'll stabilize, the patio doesn't sink anymore. When you put the patio in, I'm assuming you thought it would not sink. My question is,
It doesn't go across that.
how long a fix are these stones? Are these stones gonna give you a 50-year fix, a 100-year fix, a 25-year fix? And at what point will the next fix need to happen? I'm wondering if you know the answer to that.
In 100 years, I'll be 175. So that's
I understand it may not be your concern, but it's a
but
question.
no, and I understand what your concern is, but there's another component to this fix, which we've actually looked into, in which the city is going to do. The city is proposing, I believe, building a concrete boardwalk through a wetland, and it's supported on helical piles. Well, we're looking into helical piles right near as part of our engineering solution. And what's happening on our property with the dirt is not much different than if you garden or do anything else or put down mulch. You notice over time that it changes some. And
I was just wondering if you had been given a timeline on the efficacy of this fix.
I don't know that anybody can tell us definitively, but between the helical piles, which we may be using, and these stones, if you saw the area in question, which is not much bigger than your table area, we're not intruding into anything. We're far from the stream. We've done everything we can to help the environment where we are. It's basically, and we fall under almost every regulation about slopes and repairing on slopes. It's where certain regulations interfaced with other regulations and negated the ability to do something. And that's basically all we're asking. We just want to get this.
So I think we're.
If you're ready.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, are we ready to? Okay, so I guess I'll make a motion. I move that we send the revised language, the yellow and the blue. The yellow having the change with the extra third item about not expanding the impervious surface, and staff can word that the best way, to send that on to City Council for their consideration at the next meeting.
Sure.
I would just like, this language has been drafted by staff, but not reviewed by the city attorney yet. So there may be some very minor tweaks in that to make sure that we're being consistent. I just want to sort of, you know, we're on an accelerated timeline. So if we missed a cross-reference or we deleted something that was supposed to be.
Yes, so we'll include that in the motion. The motion should also be amended to include the.
Subject to city attorney review.
Yep.
Okay, any discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Paul Engels as well. That was everybody?
Yep.
Okay, so unanimous with our present members.
Hey, Jesse, who seconded that motion?
Michael did.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we do have a few more agenda items that we're gonna hopefully race through.
Before we move on, there's just one thing I want to really jump on quickly under all of this, which is the definition of steep slopes, which I just want to put a place marker on it for the future. I don't know if it's been an issue, but when I was on the DRB in Shelburne, when steep slopes are just defined by a percent, it gets very hard for the DRB to make a judgment, because if it's 25% over 100 feet or 25% over 5 feet or 25% over a quarter of a mile.
We can talk about it offline. We do have a definition here that
Okay,
likely addresses that, but it is still a complex subject. So happy to follow.
if it, I just wanted to make sure that if it's addressed, I have no problem. I just ran into that a while ago. Okay.
Hi, we have street names, one of my favorite things. So off of Park Road near the corner of Dorset, we have a little map on our packet. Two street names. We have Trails Bend Drive and Park Road. No. That and Brookfield Drive. Here's our little map. A bunch of the roads around here have golf related names.
Yeah, these were names that were
Mr. Easton, would you mind if I came and had a look at your property, just so that I have a sense of what you're facing?
It's fine with us, but I mean, you're gonna have to clear that with the board, and I don't know if the city.
Oh, we're not asking as a board.
No, it's just
Michael's
me.
privately asking.
Just for me personally, so I need to educate myself. Put it that way.
If that's permissible with the board and with the city regulations, it'd be fine. Paul has our phone number and all of our contact information. I don't want to take up any more of your time, but
thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for everything. So.
Okay, we got some road names.
Yeah, so these were both presented by the applicant. We compared them with E911 of both South Burlington and our surrounding municipalities for anything that was too similar, too close, for possible emergency confusion, and a few other standards we kind of look at about, is anything inaccurate? Is any, you can't have Old Farm Road when there is no farm, stuff like that. That's a Paul rule. No fake history. No fake history is a Paul rule. Neither of these are named after humans. So that's another thing that we look at closely. If a human is being
trail.
So what's that?
Is there actually a trail? It's Trails Bend Drive.
It's across the road, isn't it?
So across the road is additional development.
No, the trail's across the road. That's what I'm saying.
Oh,
the bike
path is
on the south side.
Yeah.
So where it bends around.
So is the curved road the Trails Bend?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Trail the western. So this is oriented north-south. And the western one would be Trails Bend, and that's how I worded the motion. That the western one would be Trails Bend, and the other, the straighter one, this eastern one, would be Brookfield.
Yep.
No, I move to accept the names: Trails Bend Drive for the west private road on Park Road Commons, south of Park Road.
Park Road Commons is the name of the little development.
He's just reading with you.
Yeah. And Brookfield Drive for the east private road on Park Road Commons, south of Park Road.
I second.
Okay, any discussion on the motion? Any comment from anyone? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Paul Engels raised his hand saying aye, so we
Aye.
are great. We are unanimous. We can move on to minutes. We have March 21 and March 28.
Yep. I move to approve the minutes of March 21st, 2023 and March 28th, 2023 as written.
Second.
Okay, Francis seconded. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor of the minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. Other business. There's the City of Winooski regulations in case anyone had any questions.
I think we should go through those line by line.
Over 40 pages of them.
I'm going to assume Michael's joking. But I do want to.
It's a bold assumption.
Also add.
But I do want to note just super briefly that this is Winooski, sort of making adjustments to their form-based code as they go, as you were talking, and then B, following some things that we and now Burlington have both done, which is to address parking and sort of reduce the priority of parking in regulatory settings. So, this is becoming a trend in our area to do this. So just want to note that.
Upcoming meetings, it's not officially on the agenda. But I think there were a few of us that were going to be out for some of the May ones. So
I'm out for both May and I get back very late on the 9th.
Okay, because I'm also out for both May ones.
I'm out for the second May one.
You're out for the second May one, the 23rd.
No, I'm out for May and June, May 9th and.
That's all the fun part.
The meetings are May 9th, May 23rd, June 13th, and June 27th.
June 13th.
So for May 9th, can we take these one at a time so we get a sense as to
Mm-hmm.
whether we need to make any adjustments? On May 9th, who is unlikely to be able to attend? 2 at a minimum. Okay. And on May 23rd?
I think there's 3 of us out.
Michael, are you out on May 23rd?
I'm just looking. No, I'm here.
May 23rd.
Yeah, he's back in between 2 misses.
Okay. So we have 2 also absent on May 23rd. And then June.
We don't know about Donna.
Right. And then June, can I ask about May 31st? Because that was one that we were contemplating as an additional one.
I'm okay.
May 30th.
May 30th, the 5th Tuesday.
Yeah, that would make sense to.
I'm okay.
Okay, so everybody's okay for that one.
And I'm okay for June 13th.
June 13th is the June.
Okay.
No, I'm back.
I'm here.
Okay, so we should check in with the other commissioners about the 9th and the 23rd because there's at least 2 gone for each of those.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Paul, I was looking in the other direction. Are you available on those dates?
All the dates are good for me.
We appreciate that, Paul.
Do I get to chair one if I'm the only person there?
Jessica, you had folks coming back in the room.
Okay.
Just as a comment, when we were going out, somebody mentioned a site visit, and I can certainly understand that, but there was an article in the April 3rd issue of the Vermont Digger, and I would certainly, you know the law better than I do, but I certainly would caution the group before scheduling any kind of site visits, because in Morristown, the Development Review Board went to see a site, and to avoid a quorum, they went in small groups. And according to the state, they're viewing that as trying to circumvent the law. And also, if you had to warn a meeting and all of the public would be invited to come and walk around our property, I think that that's something.
No, it's just me, nothing to do with the Planning Commission,
yeah,
just me.
But I would urge you to seek counsel on that, to see if you are a member of a council and to see whether there's any ex parte problems with coming to a site.
Right. So I think because we're in a public setting, I'll take a shot at answering that. I'm not an attorney, but right. If a private individual, not as a board, wishes to visit a site and they're not in a development review phase, because this is the role of a DRB is different from a planning commission, I don't see an open meeting law challenge with that. However, it is entirely offline, up to you as to whether you want to allow a private individual on, and that's entirely with you.
Right. I just didn't want to have a problem created for you.
Yep. And I think the only other thing I'd say is don't feel pressured to say yes because there's a board member. Because as a private citizen, that's entirely up to you. And so thank you for raising it. And we paid very close attention to the subject.
I don't want to take up any time, but I have faced something similar to what you're facing. When I lived in Texas, my house was downstream from a pond. There was a spillway, which went from a trickle to a roaring torrent, depending on the weather. And when it was a roaring torrent, it moved the bank and slowly came towards my house. And I asked our flood insurance people, do you want to do something about this? He said, no, we have to wait until you balance.
We're adjourned.
Yes.
So,
thank you very much.
We are now adjourned. Yes. We got our final.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Hey, folks. One of the things some of you know this. It's stopped.
Paul, you're still there?
No.
Yeah.
Well, actually, wait. Don't leave yet.
I can stop.
Hey, Paul. Before you go, no, it's fine.
Okay.
Before you go, yes, you can stop.